The euphoria that greeted the Treaty of Paris in 1783 was intoxicating, but fleeting. America was sovereign, yes, but its future was as unstable as the frontier winds. On the map, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the imposing curve of the Mississippi River, an extraordinary gift of territory from a defeated Britain. Yet, this expansion was a geographical hallucination. The new republic controlled only a narrow coastal strip. Beyond the Appalachian ridges lay the vast, untamed, and fiercely contested realm known as the Ohio Country. This first horizon was not merely empty space waiting for flags and fences. It was a chaotic vacuum of power. Spain held the crucial port of New Orleans and the entire lower Mississippi, giving them a chokehold on American trade. To the north, the British, in a flagrant violation of the treaty, retained control of key fortifications like Fort Detroit and Fort Niagara, using them as staging grounds to arm and influence their Native American allies. The new nation, burdened by crushing Revolutionary War debt and governed by the weak Articles of Confederation, faced an existential dilemma. Either aggressively occupy and monetize the West, or watch its hard-won independence dissolve under the pressure of foreign rivals and domestic bankruptcy. The destiny of the United States was staked on the Ohio River. The most immediate danger to the Union was internal. Several large states, notably Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, possessed sprawling, ill-defined colonial charters that claimed millions of acres stretching to the Mississippi. These overlapping claims led to bitter disputes, threatening to tear the newly formed Confederation apart. States without Western claims, such as Maryland, refused to ratify the Articles until the issue was settled. The crucial intervention came from the visionaries, including George Washington himself, who was both a statesman and a shrewd land speculator. He recognized that the West was the only asset large enough to pay the staggering $40 million in war debt and secured the loyalty of the Continental Army veterans who had been promised land in lieu of pay. Washington passionately argued that the states must cede their Western holdings to the federal government, making the lands a common estate, the collateral for the Republic's future. This act of cession, driven by fiscal necessity, was a revolutionary political compromise, transforming the West from a source of conflict into the very foundation of national unity.
With the land now federal property, the challenge shifted from political ownership to practical organization. How could the government convert untamed wilderness into sellable parcels? Thomas Jefferson, then Congress's guiding hand, provided the answer with the Land Ordinance of 1785. Jefferson, an agrarian philosopher, detested the chaotic, winding boundaries and disputed deeds of the eastern states. His solution was simple, brilliant, and uniquely American: the grid. The ordinance mandated that the western territories be mapped into a perfectly uniform geometric pattern. Surveyors, using compass and chain, would carve the land into 6-mile square townships, each subdivided into 36 numbered 1-mile square sections. This elegant Cartesian system eliminated ambiguity, facilitated sales, and projected an image of perfect rational order onto the chaos of the wilderness. It was the antithesis of the Old World's feudal land systems. Furthermore, the ordinance contained a foundational clause. Section 16 in every township was reserved for the maintenance of public schools. This was not just a real estate scheme, it was a blueprint for a republic built on educated citizens, with the very land itself funding the future. The final and most historically significant piece of legislation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Drafted while the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, this law solved the governance question, outlining a smooth, 3-stage path for territories to progress to equal statehood. It ensured that the West would not be ruled as colonial dependencies, but would join the Union on equal footing with the original 13 states, a masterstroke that guaranteed the durability of the expanding nation. But the ordinance contained a clause that was both a profound moral victory and a spark for future civil war. Article 6, which forever banned slavery in the vast territory north of the Ohio River, modern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Driven by northern statesmen like Nathan Dane and supported by the pragmatic realization that the government needed northerners to buy the land, This act drew the first decisive ethical line across the American map. It established a free West, a vast area where the Republic's highest ideal of liberty would theoretically hold sway, setting up a crushing counterbalance to the Southern slave economy and cementing the sectional divide that would erupt 70 years later. While Congress carved the land into orderly squares, the true owners of the Ohio Country prepared for war. To the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and numerous other indigenous nations, the Ohio River was a boundary, not an invitation. They had never ceded this land, and they viewed the arrival of American settlers, whom they called Long Knives, as a direct invasion. The settlers, often moving into the territory illegally before organized surveys were complete, intensified the conflict. Under the brilliant leadership of the Miami chief Little Turtle, Mishkinaqua, and the Shawnee chief Blue Jacket, Wet'suwet'en, the disparate native nations formed a powerful military confederacy. Their goal was simple: to hold the Ohio River as a permanent boundary and stop the flood of white migration. They were masters of the forest, utilizing the terrain for devastating ambushes. In their view, the so-called American Genesis was nothing less than a spiritual and physical apocalypse. The newly formed U.S. government, desperate to protect its investment, the land, and the settlers it had implicitly invited, attempted to assert military control. The first expedition, led by General Josiah Harmer in 1790, was a catastrophic failure. His poorly trained, ill-disciplined militia troops were easily outmaneuvered and defeated by Little Turtle's forces. The national embarrassment demanded a stronger response. President Washington, deeply concerned, appointed his former Revolutionary War comrade, General Arthur St. Clair, as the next commander and governor of the Northwest Territory. In November 1791, St. Clair led approximately 1,400 men deep into the territory. He was unprepared, overconfident, and fatally slow. On the morning of November 4th, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket launched a devastating surprise assault on St. Clair's camp near the Wabash River. The resulting battle was a complete rout. Over 900 American soldiers, wives, and camp followers were killed or wounded. This single defeat remains, proportionally, the greatest loss of life ever suffered by the U.S. Army at the hands of indigenous forces. St. Clair's catastrophe paralyzed the nation, plunging Congress into deep doubt and cementing the Confederacy's control over the frontier. St. Clair's defeat was an existential moment. Washington understood that another loss would mean the irreversible failure of the entire Western project. He demanded a new, highly professional force, free from the incompetence of the state militias. His choice for commander was the fiery, aggressive Revolutionary War veteran General Anthony Wayne, famously nicknamed Mad Anthony. Wayne was meticulous. He spent 2 years at Legionville, Pennsylvania, doing something unprecedented, creating America's first standing professional peacetime army, the Legion of the United States. He drilled his troops relentlessly in forest tactics, bayonet charges, and discipline, specifically training them to face Native American methods of ambush and skirmish. This was a war of psychological attrition as much as military might. Wayne slowly and methodically built a series of fortified supply posts, inching the American presence deeper into the territory, signaling an unwavering national commitment that the previous commanders had lacked. The final confrontation occurred on August 20, 1794, at a location near present-day Maumee, Ohio, known as Fallen Timbers, a chaotic area of woods leveled by a storm, which the native Confederacy believed would afford them a defensive advantage. Wayne was ready. His legion moved with coordinated precision, driving the enemy from their positions with a sustained bayonet charge. The battle itself was relatively short, but its political and strategic consequences were immense. The most crucial moment occurred after the native retreat. When the warriors sought refuge at the nearby British-held Fort Miami, the gates remained firmly closed. The British, fearing a full-scale war with the powerful, reorganized American military, had abandoned their allies. This betrayal shattered the Native American Confederacy's morale and demonstrated to all nations that the Americans were now the dominant power in the region. The victory at Fallen Timbers was the military enforcement of the Northwest Ordinance, decisively opening the first horizon for American settlement. The victory was sealed the following year with the Treaty of Greenville. Wayne dictated the terms to the defeated chiefs, compelling them to cede most of present-day Ohio and parts of Indiana to the U.S. government. The treaty established the Greenville Treaty Line, opening massive tracts of fertile land to the waiting flood of American pioneers.
The impact of Greenville was immediate and profound. It triggered the first great surge of American westward migration, rapidly populating the Ohio Valley. Yet, it also finalized the tragedy of the indigenous nations, reducing them to scattered, diminishing territories. The First Horizon, which began as a legislative experiment in democracy and land management, concluded with a military act of conquest, cementing the notion that manifest destiny, the driving force of America's future, would be fueled by the displacement of those who stood in the way of expansion. The nation's genesis was secured, but the shadow of conflict over the land would linger for centuries. The year is 1795. The Treaty of Greenville has momentarily silenced the guns in the Ohio country, and the American government, headquartered in the nascent capital, feels a fragile, temporary triumph. However, the victory was localized. The true, terrifying scale of the new United States lay beyond the thin veneer of order imposed north of the Ohio River. Across the vast, shadowy expanse stretching towards the Mississippi and beyond, the government held title to land it did not know, could not police, and certainly did not control. This ignorance was an existential threat. How could a republic built on land and liberty guarantee the value of its currency or the security of its citizens, when the very geographic foundation was a mystery? This overwhelming lack of knowledge became the primary driver for the next stage of expansion. The initial answer to this problem did not come from legislative halls or military command centers, but from the most rugged, independent individuals the frontier had to offer: the Long Hunters. These men, often originating from the settled fringes of Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, were the true unofficial vanguard. They were neither farmers seeking permanent settlement nor soldiers on official maneuvers. They were economic pioneers driven by the relentless global demand for fur. Their method was simple but brutal. They journeyed far beyond the last permanent settlement, staying out for 9 months or more, hence the long hunt, to gather immense quantities of deer skins and beaver pelts. Their survival depended on a unique, precarious balance: deep knowledge of indigenous trails and customs, absolute self-reliance, and an acceptance of constant mortal danger. They traversed the dense, dark woods of Tennessee and Kentucky, regions known to native nations but shrouded in mythical danger to the eastern settlers.
No long hunter is more synonymous with the opening of the frontier than Daniel Boone. Boone was not merely a hunter, he was a liminal figure who perfectly embodied the transition from wilderness survival to settlement enterprise. His personal mythology, a man always happiest on the fringe, always seeking the land just beyond the smoke of the last cabin, became the template for the American pioneer spirit. His tireless exploration of Kentucky in the 1760s and 70s transformed an unknown wilderness into the promised land for thousands of land-starved Americans. Boone's greatest contribution was a physical one, the blazing of the Wilderness Road in 1775. Though earlier travelers had noted the passage, Boone, hired by the Transylvania Company, cut and cleared a 200-mile-long trail through the Cumberland Gap, a narrow V-shaped notch in the Appalachian Mountains. This gap, created by ancient geological forces, served as the only practical low-elevation passageway through the southern mountains. Boone's team worked under the constant threat of attack from Shawnee and Cherokee groups who fiercely defended their hunting grounds.
The path they created was crude, dangerous, and often impassable in wet weather, but it was there. It was the first, tangible, permanent artery leading into the heart of the continent. By 1790, an estimated 70,000 settlers had used the Wilderness Road, transforming Kentucky from a contested hunting ground into the 15th state to join the Union. This trail solidified the concept that American sovereignty would follow the movement of its citizens, not just its armies. The Long Hunters, with Boone at their head, were the human wedge that cracked the continental barrier, opening the door for the explosive settlement and the massive commercial ventures that would soon dominate the West. The relentless westward drive of the Long Hunters was not fueled by abstract ideals of democracy, but by a very specific, soft-furred creature, the North American beaver. This animal, and specifically the dense, durable underfur used for making felt, was the engine of global commerce and the invisible hand guiding American expansion. For nearly 2 centuries, the beaver hat had defined European high fashion, a symbol of wealth, status, and stability. The insatiable demand created a transatlantic economic pipeline that valued the North American wilderness not for its timber or gold, but for the dark, water-repellent pelts known in the trade as castor gras.
For the debt-crippled American government, the fur trade was more than just commerce. It was a desperately needed source of hard currency. The plume, a single prime beaver pelt, became the unit of exchange in the wilderness, often more reliable than the shaky paper currency issued by the young republic. Trappers and Native American hunters exchanged their pelts for essential trade goods: iron traps, gunpowder, lead, knives, blankets, and, ominously, whiskey. This economic transaction was fiercely competitive, marked by rivalry with the powerful British Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, which had long dominated the Great Lakes and Canadian territories. American expansion into the fur trade was therefore an aggressive act of economic nationalism, a direct challenge to the commercial authority of Britain. This competition inevitably led to the establishment of fixed trading posts deep in the interior, forts that became permanent, tangible claims of sovereignty far exceeding the reach of government administration. These posts, often built at strategic river confluences, were not just marketplaces. They were miniature armed embassies of American intent. The systematic pursuit of the beaver, however, carried catastrophic consequences. The methods, particularly the use of the destructive iron trap, led to the rapid and total depletion of the resource in the East, forcing the trade further and further into indigenous lands. The insatiable European appetite for fashion thus laid the groundwork for environmental collapse and the systematic displacement of native populations, proving that the forces of market demand were often more destructive than any army. The beaver was the commodity that made the wilderness profitable and therefore irresistible to the burgeoning American state. The chaotic, high-risk world of the independent hunter and competing posts was soon to be rationalized and dominated by a single, formidable corporate entity, the American Fur Company, AFC, founded by John Jacob Astor. Astor, a German immigrant, possessed a vision that transcended the simple act of trading pelts. His genius lay in vertical integration and the ruthless pursuit of monopoly. He was not satisfied merely buying and selling. He sought to control every link in the supply chain, from the trapper in the wilderness to the financier in London. Astor amassed his fortune through brilliant strategy. He purchased trade goods in Europe at wholesale prices, shipped them to America, and distributed them through his controlled network of Western posts. The pelts acquired in exchange were then shipped back to the lucrative markets of London and China, cutting out every middleman. This gave him the power to undercut his competitors, financially strangle smaller operations, and ultimately dictate the market price for the plume. Crucially, Astor understood the symbiotic relationship between commerce and power. He was an adept political lobbyist, cultivating relationships with presidents and key congressmen. His most significant political victory was the lobbying for the Indian Factory Act's demise. This federal system of government-run trading houses was intended to protect Native Americans from unscrupulous private traders. Astor argued successfully that the government houses were inefficient and unfair, leading to their repeal in 1822.
The vacuum created by the government's retreat was immediately and ruthlessly filled by the AFC, which used its immense capital to push out all remaining competitors, especially the British. Astor's ambition famously extended to the Pacific coast. His Pacific Fur Company established Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River in modern Oregon in 1811. Though the War of 1812 forced him to temporarily sell the post to the British, the venture signaled a breathtaking ambition, a transcontinental commercial empire. By the 1830s, the AFC reigned supreme. Astor retired the richest man in America, leaving behind a clear, terrifying blueprint. The commercial conquest of the West would be achieved not by rugged individualism, but by centralized capital and political manipulation, ensuring that the fruits of the frontier flowed directly back to the financial centers of the East. Long before the American Fur Company stamped its authority on the Missouri River, the interior's lifeblood was controlled by the rhythmic paddle strokes of the voyageurs, the French-Canadian boatmen who served the British and French trade networks. These men, tough and diminutive, were the undisputed logistical masters of the North American waterway system. Their vessels, the great birch bark canoes, the Canot du Mâtre, could carry loads of up to 4 tons, linking distant posts across thousands of miles of lakes and tangled rivers. They were fueled by a monotonous diet of lye hominy or pea soup, paddling 16 hours a day, singing folk songs that masked the intense physical agony of their labor. The center of their universe, and soon the central launching pad for all American Western expansion, was St. Louis. Positioned strategically near the confluence of the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers, St. Louis was the sophisticated cosmopolitan gateway to the unknown. It was where the French commercial culture, defined by native partnerships, long-term credit, and the voyageurs' efficiency, met the aggressive, short-term American capitalism. American explorers and traders, including the great expeditions to follow, were utterly dependent on the voyageurs' unique skills, their ability to read the water, their intimate knowledge of the portages, the overland carries where they hauled 90-pound pieces on their backs, and their proficiency in multiple native languages. The voyageurs' presence meant that the American push did not enter a blank slate. It entered a system that was already functioning, deeply rooted in centuries of Franco-Indigenous interaction. While Astor's money paid for the expedition, it was the voyageurs' muscle and knowledge that made the journey possible. A crucial, often overlooked French-speaking workforce that literally carried American manifest destiny inland. The depletion of the beaver in the eastern forests and the collapse of the river-based post system forced the American trade to adapt dramatically. The focus shifted westward, past the plains, and into the majestic, hostile realm of the Rocky Mountains. This geological barrier gave birth to a new American icon, the mountain man. Driven by the promise of untapped beaver streams, these men, figures like Jedediah Smith, the pious book-reading adventurer, Jim Bridger, the encyclopedic guide and humorist, and Kit Carson, the quiet, deadly effective frontiersman, were the ultimate wilderness specialists. The mountain man was a study in self-reliance, living a solitary life that bordered on the ascetic. They adapted native dress, survival techniques, and languages, subsisting almost entirely on buffalo and elk meat. Their daily reality was one of profound risk: blizzards, grizzly bears, chronic starvation, and the constant threat of attack from tribes defending their territory, particularly the fearsome Blackfeet. They were the shock troops of the fur trade, operating outside the law and beyond the reach of corporate oversight, often spending years without seeing a settlement. Their historical importance transcends their role as trappers. They were the first to fully explore and map the interior of the continent, driven by the desperate need to find a way to the next rich beaver stream. They documented passes, rivers, and valleys that would remain unknown to the government for decades. Their most critical contribution was the discovery of the South Pass, a wide, gradual depression in Wyoming's Wind River Range. Unlike the dramatic snow-choked high peaks that made wagon travel impossible, the South Pass was a gentle, rolling plateau. This discovery, made by trappers like Jedediah Smith seeking a reliable route, was a geographical secret that would later become the key to continental migration. The South Pass served as the indispensable bottleneck for the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, funneling hundreds of thousands of settlers safely across the Continental Divide. The mountain men were thus the accidental cartographers of American destiny, their rough trails evolving into the essential highways of the future.
For 6 weeks, the valley would transform into a temporary anarchic metropolis. Thousands would gather, the solitary mountain men, their long-held pelts ready for trade, American Fur Company agents ready to dictate prices, and thousands of Native Americans, including the Shoshone, Flathead, and Nez Perce, who came to trade, negotiate, and socialize. The atmosphere was a chaotic fusion of cultures: trading, feasting, drinking, competitive games, and frequent violence. Trappers squandered a year's wages in days, buying supplies, exchanging tall tales, and indulging in long-suppressed vices. The rendezvous served as the essential social and economic nexus of the high country. It was the moment debts were settled, new credit extended, and crucial intelligence, from the location of the next untapped beaver stream to the movement of hostile tribes, was exchanged. It was a spectacular, uncontrolled expression of frontier capitalism, demonstrating that the market, and not the government, was the true organizing force of the Far West. Though ephemeral, the rendezvous system solidified the financial mechanisms that kept the high-risk enterprise profitable, providing the necessary supplies that sustain the American presence deep within the continent. The Mountain Man era was tragically short-lived, doomed by its own rapacious efficiency and a shift in European fashion. By the late 1830s, decades of relentless trapping had decimated the beaver population across the Rockies, making the pursuit financially unsustainable. The fatal blow came not from the wilderness, but from London. European fashion pivoted from the heavy felt beaver hat to the lighter, more elegant silk hat. The economic engine driving the exploration of the West seized up almost overnight. The sudden collapse of the beaver market did not mean the collapse of the American presence, however. The trappers had unknowingly fulfilled a new role. Their trails, their passes, and their knowledge were now immensely valuable to the next great wave, the settlers and missionaries driven by the concept of manifest destiny. Figures like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson seamlessly transitioned from trapping to scouting and guiding the massive caravans of covered wagons that began rolling west on the very trails they had blazed. The mountain man, the epitome of the solitary fur seeker, became the reluctant usher for mass American civilization. Yet, the legacy of the fur trade was tragically etched on the land and its original inhabitants. The trade routes that brought iron traps also brought devastating waves of disease. The 1837 smallpox epidemic, carried up the Missouri River by trade vessels, virtually annihilating entire tribes like the Mandan, crippling the political and economic structures of the region. The depopulated landscapes, stripped of their primary wildlife and weakened socially, were left vulnerable to the massive, permanent influx of settlers. The first horizon, mapped and made knowable by the pursuit. The year is 1803. The fragile union of American states faced a challenge far more menacing than any lingering British resentment or Native American resistance: the control of a single, crucial waterway. Everything west of the Appalachian Mountains, the grains, the hogs, the timber, the entire economic yield of the burgeoning West, had to be funneled down the Mississippi River. The entire commercial lifeblood of the nation's interior was forced to exit through a single Spanish-controlled gateway, the Port of New Orleans. For President Thomas Jefferson, this foreign chokehold was an existential threat to his core political philosophy. Jefferson's ideal vision for America was an agrarian republic, a decentralized democracy composed of independent, land-owning farmers whose self-sufficiency guaranteed their liberty. But how could these freeholders be truly independent if their economic destiny was subject to the whim of a European crown? The simmering anxiety boiled over with the secret 1800 Treaty of San Ildefonso.
Spain, a predictable and fading power, ceded the vast, ill-defined Louisiana territory back to France. And France was ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte, a military colossus with limitless ambition. The thought of a bellicose French empire controlling the North American heartland, commanding the Mississippi, and potentially forging an alliance with British Canada sent shivers through the American government. The geopolitical situation was dire. In 1802, the Spanish colonial administrator in New Orleans, still operating under French instruction, abruptly revoked the American right of deposit, the critical privilege that allowed American goods to be stored tax-free for transfer onto ocean-going vessels. The river was suddenly closed. Western farmers facing ruin threatened secession. They would not tolerate having their livelihoods dictated by a foreign flag. Jefferson was frantic. He wrote to James Monroe, stating that the situation was so grave that the U.S. might be forced to abandon its long-standing neutrality and marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. This willingness to align with the former enemy underscored the sheer desperation. His initial mandate was clear: secure New Orleans and the Floridas for up to $10 million. The goal was purely pragmatic: to ensure free access to the sea. The president, the champion of limited government, was prepared to risk war, alliances, and constitutional principle merely to buy a port city. He was focused on solving a single acute logistical problem, completely unaware that the ambition of Napoleon and the chaos of the Caribbean were about to thrust an entire continent into his hands. The sudden shift in Napoleon's policy, the willingness to sell an entire continent, was not a sign of French generosity, but a devastating consequence of events 3,000 miles away, in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Napoleon's grand vision for a renewed French empire in the New World was anchored not in Louisiana, but in the supremely wealthy slave colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti.
But Napoleon's dream crashed violently against the revolutionary will of enslaved people led by Toussaint Louverture. The Haitian Revolution was a profound, unprecedented success. In 1802, Napoleon dispatched his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with an immense expeditionary force of over 30,000 troops, tasked with crushing the revolt and, critically, re-establishing slavery. The French campaign was initially successful, capturing Louverture. But the real, microscopic enemy soon emerged: yellow fever. Known chillingly as the vomito negro, the disease ravaged the French ranks, killing thousands upon thousands of soldiers and officers, including Leclerc himself. The tenacious resistance of the Haitian revolutionaries, combined with the biological warfare waged by the mosquito, utterly annihilated the expedition. Napoleon watched helplessly as his army was decimated and his colonial anchor sank beneath the Caribbean waves. The implications were instantaneous and continental. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana was militarily indefensible and economically useless. It became an unwanted liability, impossible to hold against the inevitable renewal of war with Great Britain. Selling the territory achieved two crucial strategic goals for Napoleon. First, it immediately secured a massive sum of cash, funds desperately needed to finance his impending European military campaigns. Second, and equally important, selling it to the United States would prevent the British, his greatest maritime rival, from seizing Louisiana and further consolidating their North American power. The fate of the American West was therefore determined not by American negotiation, but by the successful resistance of the Haitian people and the biological power of a tropical virus. Robert Livingston, the American minister in Paris, had endured months of frustration, dealing with the evasive and aloof French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. Talleyrand, a master diplomat, had consistently denied any knowledge of the Louisiana transfer from Spain. Livingston's instructions were clear: buy New Orleans. The situation changed dramatically in April 1803. Napoleon had made his strategic retreat from the New World.
On April 11th, Talleyrand stunned Livingston with a proposal that shattered all previous assumptions. He inquired not about the price of New Orleans, but about the price the Americans would pay for the entirety of Louisiana. Livingston was momentarily stunned. He was operating on instructions that authorized $10 million for a city and some coastal land, yet he was being offered a continent. He played for time, and 2 days later, James Monroe, Jefferson's special envoy, arrived. The two men faced a crisis of conscience and constitutional authority. They knew the offer was tied to Napoleon's immediate need for war funds and would vanish the moment his military priorities shifted or Britain moved. They had no time to wait for instructions from the distant capital. Acting decisively, they concluded that the geopolitical security of the nation justified exceeding their constitutional mandate. The negotiation was tense but swift. The final price settled at $15 million, or approximately 68 million French francs. For this amount, the U.S. acquired approximately 828,000 square miles, or 2.14 million square kilometers, an area larger than the combined territories of France, Spain, Germany, Italy, and Great Britain. The price is calculated to be roughly 3 cents per acre. It instantly doubled the size of the United States, fundamentally changing its status from a collection of states to a continental power. A triumphant Livingston, grasping the moment's historical gravity, declared, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives." From this day, the United States takes its place among the powers of the first rank. They had been sent to secure a vital river port and returned having acquired an empire. When news of the purchase reached Washington, Jefferson was less triumphant and more philosophically tortured. The man who had railed against Federalist expansion of power now stood ready to execute the most massive exercise of executive authority in American history. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government possessed only those powers explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. Searching the document, he found no clause granting the executive or legislative branch the authority to acquire foreign territory and incorporate its residents into the Union. His initial reaction was to insist on a constitutional amendment to legitimize the purchase retroactively. The less said about any constitutional difficulty, the better, he advised his Secretary of State, James Madison, but his conscience demanded compliance. However, Madison and others quickly countered. A 3-month delay for an amendment risked the deal collapsing, either through Napoleon's changing mind or British military seizure. Pragmatism warred brutally with principle. Jefferson ultimately chose the path of pragmatic nationalism. He swallowed his constitutional objections, justifying his actions by invoking the higher law of national survival and public good. The Louisiana Purchase became the supreme example of an American leader expanding executive power based on necessity, setting a powerful and often controversial precedent for future presidents. The Federalists, once champions of a strong central government, now ironically became the strict constructionists, lambasting Jefferson's tyrannical overreach. They argued the vast, unknown territory would inevitably dilute the power of the original states and lead to the fragmentation of the republic. They feared the incorporation of French and Spanish Catholics would destabilize the Anglo-Protestant culture of the Union. Despite the political storm, the Senate ratified the treaty in October 1803, recognizing that the strategic value was too great to ignore. The transfer of the territory was a slow, complex, and culturally jarring process. On November 30, 1803, Spain formally transferred the territory back to France in a brief ceremony in New Orleans. Just 20 days later, on December 20, 1803, the American flag was officially raised over the Place des Armes, now Jackson Square, marking the final, definitive transfer to the United States. The flag ceremony symbolized the end of the colonial era for the region, but also the beginning of a profound cultural collision. The population of New Orleans, though accustomed to the rule of European powers, was immediately distrustful of their new American overlords. The city was a rich, polyglot mix of French Creole, Spanish, German, Haitian, and free black populations, operating under a European civil law tradition. They were wary of the Kaintucks, the rough, aggressive American frontiersmen whose culture was defined by Anglo common law, Protestantism, and a blunt, often abrasive individualism. The Creoles, in particular, feared the imposition of American legal codes and the erosion of their French identity. Initially, the U.S. government established a transitional military authority, led by William Claiborne, who spoke no French. This initial disconnect only deepened the cultural chasms. The integration was not seamless. It was a decades-long struggle between two distinct legal, social, and linguistic traditions. The French, for instance, were baffled by the American concept of habeas corpus and jury trials, preferring the traditional codified civil law. The Americans, conversely, found the Creole social structure too rigid and Catholic. New Orleans thus became the first American metropolis to truly embody the fusion and friction of Anglo-American and Latin European culture, a vibrant, complex microcosm of the continental clash that would define the entire territory. The purchase brought not just land, but a deeply rooted foreign culture that challenged the very definition of American. One of the most astonishing facts about the Louisiana Purchase was that nobody knew exactly what had been bought. The French could only sell what they believed they had acquired from Spain, and those boundaries were vague, contradictory, and based on centuries-old imprecise maps and colonial claims. Talleyrand reportedly described the boundaries as so vague that it may be left to conjecture. The treaty defined the territory merely as the same extent that it now has in the hands of Spain, and that it had when France possessed it. This nebulous definition was a diplomatic time bomb. The Americans immediately claimed the purchase extended all the way to the Rio Grande in the southwest, territory Spain vehemently claimed, and included the Pacific Northwest based on French claims of river drainage. The acquisition of Louisiana instantly created several major border disputes with Spain over Texas, the Floridas, and the Southwest, and with Great Britain over the northern border near the lakes and the Oregon country. The act of purchasing the territory was merely the first step. The act of defining, claiming, and defending it would consume American diplomacy for the next 50 years.
This staggering geographical ignorance was the impetus for President Jefferson's most visionary action, the Commission of the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The expedition was not just about finding a rumored Northwest Passage, it was about the fundamental mission of sovereignty, to map, to catalog, to understand the flora, fauna, and native nations of the land America now claimed as its own. It was a race against time, as settlers and trappers were already pushing into the area, creating conflicts that demanded federal knowledge and authority. The purchase had unveiled a continent, but it now required American grit and scientific discipline to turn that vague claim into concrete, defensible territory. While the purchase secured the nation's economic future, it irrevocably destabilized its moral and political foundations, particularly regarding two interlocking issues: slavery and Native American policy. The vast new territory instantly reopened the agonizing debate over slavery. The Northwest Ordinance had created a clear free boundary at the Ohio River, but what about the millions of acres in the Louisiana Purchase? The existing French and Spanish populations in the southern parts of the territory, like New Orleans, already practiced slavery. To abolish it outright would have created massive political resistance and jeopardized the smooth transition of the new acquisition. Conversely, to allow it to expand would fatally undermine the moral core of the Republic. This ambiguity was not resolved for decades, eventually erupting in the Missouri Compromise, 1820, which attempted to draw an artificial line across the territory. The compromise merely delayed the inevitable, ensuring that every square mile of new territory would become a proxy battleground in the looming sectional conflict that led to the Civil War. The Louisiana Purchase was the stage on which the final, bloody act of the slavery drama would be performed.
Furthermore, the purchase amplified the crisis for indigenous populations exponentially. France had no legitimate right to sell the land, as the territory was inhabited and governed by dozens of sovereign nations, like the Sioux, Shoshone, and Osage. The purchase transferred a European claim to the United States, which quickly translated the $15 million transaction into an aggressive policy of land seizure. The American government now claimed ownership of the land and, by extension, authority over its inhabitants. This federal assertion of control, backed by the demographic tide of incoming settlers and the threat of military force, accelerated the process of treaty imposition and forced removal, leading directly to the brutal Trail of Tears and decades of frontier warfare. The purchase, hailed as a triumph of American diplomacy, became the legal justification for the systematic displacement of Native American nations from the Rockies to the Mississippi. The Louisiana Purchase remains arguably the single most important event in the geographic and geopolitical development of the United States. It was a diplomatic accident born of Haitian courage and Napoleonic expediency, but its consequences were meticulously seized upon by American ambition. It guaranteed the economic prosperity of the West by securing the Mississippi. It established the principle that the American Republic was not defined by its past, but by its future, a future of limitless expansion. The purchase provided the physical space for Jefferson's agrarian dream to breathe for another half-century, pushing the density and cultural problems of the East far into the horizon. More profoundly, it cemented the powerful, almost religious conviction known as manifest destiny. This belief that the United States was divinely ordained to spread its democratic institutions and way of life across the entire continent, from sea to shining sea, was born directly from the sheer, staggering reality of the Louisiana Purchase. The acquisition removed the last serious European barrier to American expansion and created a deep-seated belief in the nation's exceptionalism. The $15 million transaction did more than buy land. It bought the potential for a continental empire, political stability, and geographic security. It solved the immediate crisis of New Orleans, only to create the long, drawn-out crises of slavery and native displacement. But ultimately, by unveiling a continent's scale, the Louisiana Purchase irrevocably turned the nation's gaze west, setting the United States on an unstoppable trajectory toward becoming a world power defined by its boundless geography. The ink on the Louisiana Purchase Treaty was barely dry, but President Thomas Jefferson understood the profound and immediate peril of the acquisition. The United States had purchased a geographical abstraction, a vast, nebulous territory defined by outdated maps and European conjecture. To secure this land was not merely a matter of raising a flag, it was a race against time, requiring knowledge. As Jefferson himself noted, the acquisition of the country would be incomplete unless we explored it. The legal title meant little if the United States did not possess authoritative data on the land's topography, resources, and most critically, its inhabitants. For years, Jefferson had nurtured the dream of exploration. Even before the purchase, he had conceived of an expedition to chart the Missouri River, driven by the persistent, if mythical, hope of discovering the Northwest Passage. This mythical water route, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, had eluded explorers for centuries, but its potential economic and strategic value, allowing American goods to bypass European-controlled global routes, was intoxicating. The Louisiana Purchase transformed this scientific fantasy into a geopolitical necessity. Jefferson personally selected his private secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, to lead the endeavor. Lewis, a captain in the U.S. Army, was more than just a soldier. He was a man of intense curiosity, resilience, and proven loyalty. Recognizing the immense scope and specialized nature of the task, Lewis immediately chose his former commanding officer, Lieutenant William Clark, to share the command. Clark was a skilled cartographer, a proven wilderness diplomat, and possessed the talent for managing men. The partnership was one of the most successful in American history. Lewis provided the scientific discipline and military meticulousness, while Clark offered the practical frontier skills and the steady hand of leadership.
The mission was multifaceted, cloaked in scientific terminology, but rooted in military and commercial strategy. They were to map the major rivers, document the flora and fauna, identify potential commercial resources, especially minerals, and record weather patterns. Most crucially, they were to forge diplomatic relations with the dozens of indigenous nations they encountered, establishing American sovereignty and securing commercial partnerships before the British and Spanish could consolidate their influence. The expedition was named the Corps of Discovery, a title that perfectly encapsulated its dual military and exploratory purpose. The fate of the entire American West, its political structure, its commercial destiny, and its claim to continental power was entrusted to this small group of soldiers, scientists, and frontiersmen. Lewis dedicated over a year to intensive, almost obsessive preparation. Recognizing that the success of the mission hinged on accurate data, he traveled to Philadelphia, the intellectual heart of the young nation, to receive crash courses in botany, zoology, practical astronomy, and medicine from the country's leading scientists. He acquired the most sophisticated navigational and surveying instruments available: sextants, chronometers, compasses, and various thermometers, all essential for transforming geographical guesswork into certifiable fact. The logistical planning was equally meticulous. Lewis designed the keelboat, a shallow draft 55-foot vessel capable of carrying immense supplies and mounting a small swivel cannon for defense, a floating fortress, and laboratory. He commissioned a collapsible iron frame boat, the Experiment, intended for navigating the western rivers, though this would later prove to be one of the few planning failures. The supplies were a pragmatic mix of survival necessities and diplomatic tools: 193 pounds of portable soup, a beef bouillon concentrate, 130 rolls of tobacco, and 176 pounds of gunpowder. The most critical supplies, however, were for diplomacy. The Corps carried an arsenal of trade goods intended as gifts for the native nations: colorful glass beads, highly valued brass kettles, hatchets, small flags, and large amounts of specialized piece metals bearing the likeness of President Jefferson. These metals were the physical embodiment of the American claim to sovereignty, to be distributed as tokens of friendship and recognition. The very act of presenting these medals asserted that the leaders of these nations were now dealing with the American Great Father. The entire enterprise was carried out under a veil of secrecy, a necessary guard against British and Spanish espionage. The mission's true destination, the Pacific Ocean, was deliberately downplayed, framed instead as merely a scientific survey of the Missouri River. Jefferson's political genius lay in this camouflage. He used the language of Enlightenment science to mask an aggressive act of geopolitical expansion. By the spring of 1804, the Corps of Discovery was ready, a perfectly engineered tool of American ambition, poised to launch itself into the historical unknown. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery pushed off from their starting point near St. Louis, Missouri. The Corps contingent included about 45 men, comprising military personnel, civilian interpreters, and Clark's slave York. The immediate challenge was the Missouri River itself. Known as Big Muddy, its relentless current, shifting sandbars, and frequent snags made upstream travel an agonizing, exhausting labor. The men, relying on cordling, pulling the boat by rope from the bank, sailing or poling, advanced at a grueling pace of only 10 to 14 miles a day. The psychological burden of the journey quickly tested the limits of the men. Discipline was paramount, and Lewis established strict military rules, frequently resorting to public lashings for offenses like drunkenness, neglect of duty, or attempted desertion. The journals kept by both Lewis and Clark revealed the complex reality of command, balancing the need for scientific observation with the harsh necessities of wilderness survival. Clark, with his pragmatic focus, meticulously logged the geography and made detailed, beautiful maps. Lewis, the intellectual, filled volumes with descriptions of previously unknown species, from the prairie dog to the grizzly bear. The expedition quickly encountered its first major diplomatic test with the powerful Teton Sioux.
Known for their warlike reputation and their effective control over river traffic, the Sioux blocked the Corps' path near present-day Pierce, South Dakota. A tense 3-day standoff ensued. The Sioux leaders, skeptical of the American motives and dismissive of Jefferson's peace medals, demanded a toll for passage. Lewis refused, standing firm and prepared for a firefight. The situation was diffused only by Clark's coolness and a timely, stern warning that convinced the Sioux to let them pass. This encounter confirmed two critical realities. First, that American sovereignty in the West would not be established through gifts, but through a credible show of force. And second, that the river was not a vacuum, but a highly competitive zone of indigenous commerce and authority. As autumn bled into winter, the Corps successfully navigated the vast expanse of the Great Plains, passing through the lands of the friendly Odo and Missouri tribes. They were constantly documenting, constantly surveying, transforming the mythical West into a measurable, verifiable geographical space. The first leg of the journey was an overwhelming success, but the true test, the high mountains, lay ahead. By late October 1804, the Corps reached the Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes in present-day North Dakota. These villages, situated strategically on the Missouri, were centers of native commerce, attracting tribes from thousands of miles away. Lewis decided to halt for the winter, recognizing the imperative of diplomacy, rest, and preparation. The Corps constructed Fort Mandan, a triangular palisaded post that became a temporary American presence deep within the continent. The Mandan winter was a crucial interlude. It was here that the Corps gained two indispensable members, Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter, but it was Sacagawea who proved to be the expedition's most vital asset. Pregnant and barely 16, she offered a chain of linguistic translation that would become crucial. She could speak Shoshone, her native tongue, and form of Hidatsa. Charbonneau spoke Hidatsa and French, and a member of the Corps spoke French and English. This fragile chain of interpretation was the only way the Corps could communicate with the Western tribes. More than just a translator, Sacagawea was a walking sign of peace. Any native war party encountering the Corps and seeing a young woman with an infant, nicknamed Pomp, would recognize that the group was not a war party. Her presence was a diplomatic shield, softening the approach to potentially hostile tribes. Furthermore, her knowledge of the geography and ethnography of the Shoshone homelands, the very region they had to cross, was invaluable. She knew the edible plants, the water sources, and the cultural mores of the mountain people. While at Fort Mandan, Lewis and Clark diligently recorded their scientific findings. They dispatched the keelboat back down the Missouri in April 1805, carrying a vast collection of specimens: live prairie dogs, pressed plant samples, mineral samples, and detailed reports for President Jefferson. This shipment was proof of life and proof of the purchase's immense natural wealth, silencing critics in Washington and exciting the American scientific community. When the Corps, now numbering 33 permanent members, set off again, they were plunging into territory completely unknown to the white world, entering a landscape that existed only on Clark's meticulously drawn, speculative maps. They were now truly charting the unknown, reliant on the guidance of a Shoshone girl to find the source of the Missouri River.
The journey up the Missouri became increasingly difficult, climaxing at the dramatic Great Falls of the Missouri, a 16-mile stretch of 5 massive cascades. The Corps was forced to undertake a grueling portage that lasted a month. The effort was Herculaic, dragging the heavy canoes and equipment over rough, cactus-laden terrain, battling heat, hailstorms, and swarms of insects. This portage demonstrated the futility of the Northwest Passage myth. The hoped-for easy water route was blocked by a violent geographical fact. The true test lay ahead, the Rocky Mountains. Jefferson had hoped the mountains would be a gentle, low-lying range. What the Corps found was a colossal, jagged barrier of snow-capped peaks. Their survival now depended entirely on finding Sacagawea's people, the Shoshone, whose horses were necessary to traverse the range. The tension was agonizing. The Corps finally encountered a Shoshone band led by Chief Cameawait.
In a moment of high drama, Sacagawea recognized the chief. He was her long-lost brother, from whom she had been kidnapped years earlier. This miraculous reunion proved to be the diplomatic salvation of the expedition. The Shoshone, convinced by this sign of destiny and Sacagawea's pleas, provided the necessary horses and a critical guide, Toby, who led the Corps over the treacherous Bitterroot Mountains. The crossing of the Bitterroots in the late fall of 1805 was the Corps' greatest physical ordeal. Supplies ran dangerously low. The men were forced to eat candles, and finally their own horses. They were saved only by the intervention of the Nez Perce people, who, persuaded by the Corps' peaceful intentions, and possibly by a Nez Perce woman who recognized Lewis's peace medal, provided food and guidance. The Rockies had been charted, not by finding a passage, but by enduring a near-fatal climb, a testament to human fortitude and the indispensable assistance of indigenous knowledge. After the agony of the mountains, the Corps began their final descent, floating down the Clearwater, Snake, and finally the mighty Columbia River. The journey was swift, marked by the increasing density of Native American settlements and a sense of growing anticipation. The geographical reality was sinking in. The Northwest Passage was fiction, but the route to the Pacific was real, navigable, and now mapped by American hands. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote his famous journal entry, "Ocean in View. Oh, the joy." This moment of ultimate triumph marked the completion of the primary mission. They had crossed the continent. The celebration was short-lived. The winter of 1805-1806, spent on the rain-drenched coast of what is now Oregon, was miserable. The Corps constructed Fort Clatsop and faced relentless coastal rain, sickness, rampant fleas, and a monotonous diet of spoiled elk meat. During this period, Lewis and Clark demonstrated a remarkable progressive approach to democracy. A decision was needed on where to establish winter quarters. Both Lewis and Clark recorded a vote among the members, an act highly unusual for a military unit of the era. Critically, the voting group included York, Clark's slave, and Sacagawea, the Native American woman. This recorded vote, granting a voice to enslaved and indigenous persons, stands as a quiet, powerful symbol of the nascent democratic ideals the expedition carried, even if those ideals were not yet fully realized in the nation they represented. The Corps was constantly observing and trading with the Clatsop and other coastal tribes. They faced difficulty in obtaining adequate supplies and were forced to resort to desperate measures, including manufacturing their own salt by boiling seawater. The Pacific coast confirmed the wealth of the territory, its immense forests, rich fisheries, and strategic coastal potential, but also the difficulty of sustaining a permanent presence without a reliable supply line. After nearly 5 months of enduring the persistent rain and dampness, the Corps began its long, arduous journey home in March 1806. The return trip was defined by necessity and risk. To maximize their geographical intelligence, Lewis and Clark decided to split the Corps into 2 main groups in Montana. Clark took one division, aiming to explore the Yellowstone River, which he correctly mapped as a major tributary of the Missouri. Lewis, with a smaller group, took a more northerly route, intending to explore the Marias River and confirm the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, a crucial geopolitical task to counter British claims. This division led to the only hostile encounter that resulted in fatalities. While exploring the Marias River, Lewis and his 3 companions encountered a group of Blackfeet warriors, a tribe that had refused diplomatic outreach and was known for its aggression toward American trappers. During the night, the Blackfeet attempted to steal the Corps' rifles. A fight broke out, resulting in the deaths of 2 Blackfeet men. The Corps immediately fled, riding their horses nearly 120 miles without stopping to escape the inevitable revenge attack. This skirmish tragically confirmed that the diplomatic mission had failed with some of the most powerful northern tribes, foreshadowing decades of warfare between the U.S. Army and the Blackfeet. Meanwhile, Clark's group successfully navigated the Yellowstone, charting its course and discovering natural landmarks like Pompey's Pillar. He left his mark by carving his name and the date into the soft sandstone. The two groups successfully reunited below the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri, a testament to their careful planning and Clark's superb navigation skills. The reunion signaled the end of the greatest risks and the final leg of their historical journey. They had spent 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days mapping and exploring the continent. On September 23, 1806, the Corps of Discovery rode into St. Louis, Missouri. The men were thin, clad in ragged buckskin, and largely unrecognizable, having been presumed dead by the nation. Their return sparked a national celebration. President Jefferson, ecstatic, proclaimed the success a triumph of science and the vindication of the Louisiana Purchase. The legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition was immediate and far-reaching. Geographically, their maps, though containing minor inaccuracies, were the first reliable, comprehensive charting of the West, providing critical intelligence on the Missouri River system and the vital South Pass. Though not explicitly discovered by them, their maps pointed the way. Scientifically, they collected and cataloged 178 plants and 122 animals previously unknown to Western science, fundamentally changing the understanding of North American natural history. Diplomatically and politically, the expedition solidified the American claim to the entire Louisiana Territory and provided a platform for contesting the British claims to the Oregon Country. The detailed report served as an irresistible advertisement, transforming the remote wilderness into the next destination for trappers, traders, and eventually mass migration. Their maps became the foundational document for the Oregon Trail, directly paving the way for the movement of hundreds of thousands of settlers. However, the legacy was also a tragic one for the indigenous nations. The expedition confirmed the vastness and resource wealth of their lands, turning native territories into mere resources for the expanding American empire. The peace medals and treaties were swiftly forgotten as the floodgates of American settlement, the very wave the Corps had preceded, were opened. The journey of Lewis and Clark was the catalyst that transformed Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic into the continental reality of manifest destiny. The triumphant return of Lewis and Clark in 1806 did more than just expand the American map. It fundamentally altered the legal and moral framework of U.S. expansion. For centuries, the indigenous nations had operated under a principle of absolute sovereignty over their ancestral lands. While they might allow hunting access or temporary trade rights, the concept of selling land in perpetuity, especially vast tracts, was often alien and repugnant. Their relationship with the land was spiritual and communal, not a mere commodity transaction. The Ohio Country, the Great Lakes region, and the newly charted plains were their homelands, their economies, and their sacred centers. Against this ancient claim, the United States wielded a thin but devastatingly effective legal fiction, the doctrine of discovery. This European-derived principle, later codified by the U.S. Supreme Court, asserted that when a European or American nation discovered a territory inhabited by heathens or infidels, that nation automatically acquired an exclusive right to acquire land from those inhabitants. It gave the U.S. a preemptive right to the land, effectively granting the indigenous nations only the right of occupancy, not true title. In American eyes, sovereignty had been transferred from France via the Louisiana Purchase to the U.S., rendering the native nations mere tenants on land now legally owned by the federal government. This legal fiction became the most potent weapon in the American arsenal, far surpassing the effectiveness of any rifle or cannon. It was used to justify the rapid proliferation of treaties that, in reality, were coercive instruments of land transfer. As the population density increased in Ohio and Kentucky, American settlers pushed relentlessly across the Greenville Treaty Line, viewing the native people not as sovereign neighbors, but as obstacles to manifest destiny. The government, perpetually under pressure from land-hungry constituents, invariably sided with the settlers. This constant, unrelenting pressure created a profound crisis among the indigenous peoples. Their ancestral economies, dependent on hunting and trapping, were collapsing due to overhunting by white traders and the conversion of forests into farms. Their societies were ravaged by diseases and, most acutely, by the destructive introduction of whiskey, a deliberate strategy used by unscrupulous American traders to enslave and disarm native communities. The balance of power was shifting from a negotiated equilibrium to a forceful, legalistic erasure, driving the indigenous leadership toward a desperate and unified resistance. The catalyst for unified resistance did not initially come from a warrior, but from a spiritual leader. He was a Shawnee man named Lalawethika, the younger brother of the great warrior Tecumseh, and for years he was known only as a drunkard and an inconsequential member of his tribe. Then, in 1805, Lalawethika experienced a profound spiritual crisis and an apparent religious revelation during a near-death experience. He emerged transformed, abandoning alcohol and changing his name to Tenskwatawa, meaning the open door. Tenskwatawa became known as the Prophet. His message was one of cultural purification and absolute rejection of American influence. He preached that the indigenous peoples had strayed from the master of life by adopting the destructive ways of the white settlers, namely alcohol, European clothing, manufactured goods, and the very concept of individual land sales. His vision called for a return to traditional ways, communal sharing, ancestral rituals, and the rejection of all things American. He prophesied that if the tribes purified themselves and united, the master of life would sweep the white invaders back into the sea. The message resonated like a thunderclap across the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Mississippi. Tenskwatawa's spiritual movement provided a desperately needed sense of hope and moral grounding during a time of immense cultural upheaval. Tens of thousands of native people, from the Shawnee and Delaware to the Wyandot and Potawatomi, migrated to the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in Indiana Territory. There they founded Prophetstown, Tippecanoe, a rapidly growing intertribal spiritual and political center. Prophetstown was a revolutionary settlement, attempting to create a self-sufficient pan-Indian society free from American dependency. It was the physical embodiment of indigenous sovereignty, a direct challenge to Governor William Henry Harrison's authority and the American claim on the land. Tenskwatawa used his spiritual authority to solidify the alliance. He conducted purification rituals, performed what many believed to be miraculous feats, like predicting an eclipse, and galvanized the young, disillusioned warriors. While the prophet provided the moral and spiritual foundation for resistance, his older brother, Tecumseh, began the task of translating that spiritual unity into a concrete, pan-tribal political and military confederacy. The separation of powers was clear. Tenskwatawa provided the divine mandate. Tecumseh provided the geopolitical strategy. The American government, watching the population of Prophetstown swell, recognized that this was not merely a local rebellion, but the seeds of a truly continental challenge to their expansion. Tecumseh, a Shawnee war chief, was arguably the most gifted indigenous statesman and military strategist in North American history. Unlike his brother, who focused on spiritual renewal, Tecumseh focused on the existential political threat posed by the Americans. He recognized the fatal flaw in all previous resistance. The Americans negotiated with individual tribes, systematically carving off small pieces of land through separate treaties until all were extinguished. Tecumseh's radical doctrine was revolutionary. Indigenous land was held communally by all nations, not by individual tribes. This effectively invalidated every single treaty the United States had ever signed or ever hoped to sign. It was a complete rejection of the doctrine of discovery and the legal legitimacy of the U.S. treaty system. Starting around 1808, Tecumseh embarked on a breathtaking diplomatic journey. He traveled thousands of miles on foot and horseback, traversing the vast territory from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf Coast and west to the Missouri River. He spoke passionately to the Wyandot, the Seneca, the Sioux, the Fox, the Creeks, the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws. His message was consistent: unite or perish separately. He challenged the compromised elders who had signed away land for annuities and alcohol, urging young warriors to abandon the old fragmented tribal structures and join his new consolidated confederacy at Prophetstown. Tecumseh's efforts were a genuine geopolitical masterclass. He was building a pan-Indian state, a political entity capable of negotiating with the United States as an equal sovereign power, backed by a unified military front. He framed the boundary not as a temporary line, but as a permanent, sacred demarcation, the Ohio River. Everything south of the Ohio was American. Everything north and west of it belonged communally to the Indigenous nations. The British in Canada, desperate to maintain their influence in the region and limit American expansion, covertly supported Tecumseh's efforts. They supplied arms, ammunition, and rhetorical encouragement, viewing the Confederation as a vital buffer state that could shield Canada from American aggression. This three-way geopolitical game, American expansion, Indigenous unity, and British opportunism, created a highly volatile environment on the frontier, ensuring that the inevitable conflict would be global in scope. Tecumseh's grand vision placed native sovereignty squarely on the world stage, demanding recognition not as supplicants, but as a continental power. The primary American adversary facing the Confederacy was William Henry Harrison, the ambitious, land-hungry governor of the Indiana Territory, headquartered in Vincennes. Harrison, who viewed indigenous land as the key to his own political advancement and the economic growth of the territory, saw Tecumseh's doctrine of communal ownership as an unacceptable, existential threat to American law. The political clash between the two men became a personal, high-stakes duel. Harrison, determined to shatter the Confederacy before it could consolidate, repeatedly sought to undermine Tecumseh's authority. The pivotal moment came in 1809 with the Treaty of Fort Wayne. Harrison successfully pressured local, compliant chiefs of the Delaware, Potawatomi, and Miami tribes, often through liberal application of alcohol and threats of military force, to sign away over 3 million acres of land along the Wabash River. Tecumseh was incandescent. He wrote immediately to Vincennes to confront Harrison in a dramatic, heavily armed meeting in August 1810. Standing before the governor, Tecumseh delivered one of the most powerful speeches in American history. He denounced the Treaty of Fort Wayne as illegitimate, illegal, and null and void. He insisted that the chiefs who signed it were men of bad principles, who had no authority over the communal domain. He warned Harrison that if the surveyors attempted to cross the line of the ceded land, he would personally ensure that the unified warriors would meet them with violence. The confrontation was chillingly effective. Both men recognized they were not debating policy, but standing on the brink of war. Harrison, however, was politically committed to the acquisition. He saw Tecumseh not as a statesman, but as a dangerous, savage revolutionary whose success would block westward expansion forever. He demanded that Tecumseh prove that the Confederacy was strong enough to enforce its claims. This political deadlock meant that Prophetstown, the sacred heart of the Confederacy, was now officially deemed a hostile military target. Tecumseh knew he needed more time to enlist the crucial southern tribes, the Creek and Choctaw, into his confederacy before the war came. But Harrison, sensing the moment of weakness, was already mobilizing. In the summer of 1811, Tecumseh left Prophetstown on his most vital diplomatic mission, a long, dangerous journey south to rally the powerful Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations. He left Prophetstown under the command of his brother, the known to be the prophet, and had experienced the near-death experience, and experienced a profound spiritual crisis, revolution, during a near-death experience. He emerged transformed, abandoning alcohol and changing his name to Tenskwatawa, meaning the open door. Tenskwatawa became known as the Prophet. His message was one of cultural purification and absolute rejection of American influence. He preached that the indigenous peoples had strayed from the master of life by adopting the destructive ways of the white settlers, namely alcohol, European clothing, manufactured goods, and the very concept of individual land sales. His vision called for a return to traditional ways, communal sharing, ancestral rituals, and the rejection of all things American.
The Battle of Tippecanoe was a brutal, chaotic affair fought in the darkness. While the attack initially surprised the American forces, Harrison's men, hardened by frontier life, eventually rallied. The fighting lasted until dawn, when the American countercharge forced the warriors to retreat. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but the true damage was done to the Confederacy's morale. When the Americans marched into Prophetstown the next day, they found it abandoned. They looted the town, destroyed all the houses and supplies, and left the spiritual center of the resistance a smoldering ruin. The battle was a devastating political failure for Tenskwatawa. His prophecy that the bullets would not harm them proved tragically false, shattering his spiritual authority and sowing deep discord among the remaining tribes. Though the Confederacy was not militarily crushed, its heart and soul had been broken. Harrison, though tactically cautious during the battle, achieved his strategic goal. He had destroyed Prophetstown and dispersed the gathered warriors. He immediately claimed a massive victory, which would later launch his political career and earn him the nickname Old Tippecanoe. The balance of power had violently shifted. The native resistance was now forced onto a path of vengeance rather than organized political unity. Tecumseh returned from his southern mission in despair. The spiritual authority of his brother was ruined, and the momentum of the Confederacy was lost. The warriors who remained, however, were not broken. They were enraged. Tecumseh had few options left. He was now forced to abandon his dream of an independent native buffer state and embrace the role of an outright military ally to the only European power left on the continent, Great Britain. The looming conflict, the War of 1812, was the catalyst that merged the indigenous struggle for sovereignty with the global geopolitical rivalry. American warhawks, like Henry Clay, had long advocated for annexing Canada and Florida, and they viewed the British arming of the Tecumseh Confederacy as an intolerable provocation. When the U.S. formally declared war on Britain in June 1812, Tecumseh and his remaining warriors officially joined the British side, providing the crucial ground forces that Britain desperately lacked in the Western theater. Tecumseh's leadership immediately proved indispensable. He played a critical role in the British capture of Fort Detroit, terrifying the American commander, General William Hull, into surrender. He led forces in numerous engagements, proving his strategic brilliance time and again. For 2 years, Tecumseh fought with tactical genius and unyielding moral authority, temporarily reversing American gains and effectively turning the War of 1812 in the West into a war for indigenous land and survival. The turning point came in the autumn of 1813, following a decisive American naval victory on Lake Erie under Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The British were forced to abandon Detroit and retreat into Upper Canada. Tecumseh pleaded with the British commander, General Henry Proctor, to make a stand, arguing that retreating would leave their indigenous allies vulnerable and shatter the last hope of the Confederacy. Proctor reluctantly agreed to a defensive battle at the Battle of the Thames, October 5, 1813. The battle was a disaster for the British Native Alliance. Proctor's British forces quickly broke ranks, leaving Tecumseh and his warriors to fight alone against the advancing American army, led by the same William Henry Harrison he had confronted years earlier. Tecumseh, recognizing that the fate of his people lay on the field, led the charge himself. Somewhere in the chaotic fighting, the great Shawnee leader fell, though his killer was never definitively identified. His death, more than any treaty or battle, signaled the definitive end of organized, large-scale Indigenous resistance in the Old Northwest. Tecumseh's death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 was the moment the balance of power shifted forever. The Confederacy, held together primarily by his unique charisma, strategic genius, and tireless diplomacy, instantly collapsed. The remaining native leaders either fled to Canada or were forced to sue peace with the United States. The War of 1812 had been a global conflict, but in the American West, it was fundamentally a war of Indigenous survival, and the Indigenous nations lost. The consequences were immediate and ruthless. The British, in the Treaty of Ghent ending the war, abandoned their Indigenous allies entirely. The U.S. government, no longer concerned about foreign interference, moved aggressively to consolidate its claims. The military victories provided the moral and political justification to force massive new land cessions. Over the next decade, through a relentless series of treaties often secured through duplicity, pressure, and bribery, the tribes of the Old Northwest, the remnants of Tecumseh's vision, were forced to cede nearly all of their remaining land. The tide of American settlement, once contained, became an overwhelming flood. The defeat of the Confederacy cemented the final victory of the doctrine of discovery over Indigenous sovereignty. The federal government, believing the lands were now secured, began the systematic process of removal. The native people who remained were forced onto smaller, scattered reservations or pushed across the Mississippi River into the territories claimed by the Louisiana Purchase, a practice that culminated in the tragic Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Trail of Tears. The legacy of Tecumseh and his brother is a profound tragedy of American history. They achieved a level of pan-tribal unity never before seen, successfully challenging the foundational legal premise of the expanding republic. Yet they were ultimately defeated not just by superior firepower, but by the relentless, irreversible demographic and economic pressure of the United States. Their resistance stands as the last great unified defense of Indigenous sovereignty east of the Mississippi, marking the irreversible moment when the balance of power tilted decisively in favor of continental American expansion. Following the War of 1812 and the definitive collapse of Indigenous resistance east of the Mississippi, a distinct shift occurred in the American psyche. The nation, having secured its borders and its economic gateway at New Orleans, turned its collective gaze fully westward. This ambition transcended simple land acquisition. It coalesced into a driving, almost religious conviction: manifest destiny. The term itself was coined later, in 1845, by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, who wrote that it was our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us. But the ideology, the deep-seated belief system underpinning that phrase had been gestating in the American soul for decades. This ideology rested on three powerful interlocking pillars: divine mandate, a belief that God, or Providence, had specifically selected the Anglo-American race and their unique institutions, democracy, Protestantism, and capitalism, to rule the North American continent. Expansion was therefore not an aggressive act, but a sacred duty, a moral imperative to spread liberty to less fortunate peoples, particularly the Spanish and Indigenous inhabitants. This divine sanction provided a comforting moral justification for actions that were otherwise brutal acts of conquest and dispossession. Racial and cultural superiority,
a conviction widely held among white Americans that their culture, political structure, and societal norms were inherently superior to all others. They viewed Native Americans as savages, incapable of properly utilizing the land, and Mexican settlers as degenerate and incapable of maintaining a republic. Expansion was thus framed as a civilizing mission, a necessity to bring order and productive use to what they saw as wasted wilderness. Demographic and economic pressure was the practical engine of the ideology. The American birth rate was soaring. Immigrants were pouring into eastern ports. Land in the east was expensive and worn out. The desire for cheap, fertile farmland, a fundamental requirement for Jefferson's idealized agrarian democracy, created a relentless popular demand for new territory. This economic pressure was irresistible, translating popular hunger for land into official government policy. It was the American Empire disguised as democratic liberation. The stage was set for a dramatic collision with the established powers of Mexico and Great Britain.
The ideology of manifest destiny found its perfect political champion in James K. Polk. Elected in 1844, Polk was a Tennessee Democrat, an ardent protege of Andrew Jackson, and the quintessential dark horse candidate who rode the singular wave of expansionist fervor to the presidency. He ran on an unapologetic platform of expansion, promising to acquire the entirety of the Oregon country and immediately annex Texas. His victory was interpreted by his party as a popular mandate for aggressive territorial growth. Polk was a relentless, single-minded executive. He famously outlined 4 clear goals for his single term in office: lowering the tariff, reestablishing the independent treasury, and acquiring both the Oregon Territory and California. He achieved all 4. The immediate crisis lay in Texas. After winning independence from Mexico in 1836, the Republic of Texas existed as an independent nation for nearly a decade, repeatedly requesting admission to the Union. Annexation was stalled due to Northern opposition. Adding Texas would mean adding a massive slave state, tilting the balance of power in the Senate and sparking the slavery debate. Polk, ignoring the risk of war with Mexico, pushed the annexation resolution through Congress immediately after his election, and Texas was formally admitted as the 28th state in 1845. However, the annexation of Texas did not solve the border issue, it created it. Mexico considered the annexation an illegal seizure of its territory and immediately severed diplomatic relations with the U.S. Crucially, Texas claimed its border extended all the way to the Rio Grande. Mexico maintained the historical boundary was the much further north Nueces River. Polk accepted the Rio Grande claim, a strategic move that effectively asserted ownership over hundreds of miles of disputed land, deliberately setting the stage for a military confrontation. Polk knew that securing Texas was only the first step. The ultimate prize of manifest destiny was the Pacific coast, and that meant acquiring California, which Mexico was unwilling to sell. The president was willing to manufacture a war to achieve his expansionist goals. Simultaneously with the Texas crisis, Polk inherited a simmering, decades-long dispute with Great Britain over the Oregon country. This vast territory, which stretched from the northern boundary of California up to the Russian-Alaska claim at latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes north, was claimed jointly by both the U.S. and Britain. Both nations had a presence, the British primarily through the Hudson's Bay Company trading posts, and the Americans through the increasing trickle of settlers arriving via the Oregon Trail. American expansionists, fueled by manifest destiny, demanded nothing less than the entire territory. The Democratic rallying cry during the 1844 election was 54-40 or fight, a belligerent threat to declare war on Britain if they did not cede all land up to the northern parallel of 54 degrees 40 minutes north. Polk, though a firm expansionist, was too shrewd a politician to genuinely risk simultaneous wars with 2 global powers, Britain and Mexico. He needed to secure the Oregon Territory quickly and peacefully so he could focus his military resources on the Southwest. The diplomatic standoff was intense,
but ultimately resolved through pragmatic negotiation. Neither the US nor Britain truly wanted a third war. The British realized that the HBC's fur trading profits in the region were declining, and the rapidly increasing number of American settlers made the territory virtually indefensible. In 1846, the two nations agreed to the Oregon Treaty. They extended the existing boundary along the 49th parallel to the Pacific Ocean, successfully dividing the territory. The compromise was politically brilliant for Polk. While the 5440 or Fight Zealots were disappointed, the treaty secured the vital harbors of Puget Sound and gave the U.S. its crucial uncontested access to the Pacific. More importantly, it freed up the American military to concentrate on the war that Polk had been meticulously planning since taking office, the seizure of the Mexican territories of California and New Mexico. The resolution of the Oregon crisis demonstrated that while the rhetoric of Manifest Destiny was maximalist and aggressive, the political execution could be carefully calibrated to avoid overextending the young nation. The focus now shifted entirely to the south. Polk was determined to acquire California, viewing its harbors and strategic position as the ultimate physical realization of Manifest Destiny. When Mexico repeatedly refused his offers to purchase the land, Polk initiated a calculated military provocation. In January 1846, he ordered General Zachary Taylor to move his troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. This move was intended to provoke a military response from Mexico, thereby allowing the U.S. to claim that Mexico had initiated hostilities. The provocation worked. In April 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and engaged Taylor's forces, resulting in the death of 11 American soldiers. Polk immediately seized the opportunity. He went before Congress, famously declaring that Mexico had shed American blood upon the American soil. Despite fierce opposition from Whigs, including a young Abraham Lincoln, who challenged the truth of Polk's claim, dubbing it spot resolutions, Congress declared war in May 1846. The war that followed was characterized by decisive American military victories, largely due to superior artillery and the genius of its field commanders, many of whom were trained at West Point. The conflict was waged on multiple fronts. The New Mexico campaign. General Stephen Kearny led a small force west, seizing Santa Fe with minimal resistance and declaring New Mexico part of the United States. The California Campaign, Bear Flag Revolt, a small group of American settlers, supported by U.S. Army Captain John C. Fremont, declared the independent Bear Flag Republic in California. Kearny's forces soon arrived, consolidating control over the territory. The Northern Mexico Campaign, General Zachary Taylor won significant victories at Monterrey and the crucial Battle of Buena Vista, 1847, securing northern Mexico. The invasion of Mexico, the most ambitious campaign, was led by General Winscott Scott. Scott executed a flawless amphibious landing at Veracruz and marched inland, tracing the path of Hernán Cortés. His forces captured the capital, Mexico City, in September 1847, forcing the Mexican government to sue for peace. The war, however, exposed deep moral and political rifts within the U.S. Abolitionists and anti-expansionists criticized it as an unjust land grab orchestrated by the slave power to expand the plantation economy. Henry David Thoreau famously refused to pay his taxes in protest, giving rise to the concept of civil disobedience. Despite the internal dissent, the overwhelming military success ensured that the U.S. would seize massive territorial gains, completing the physical conquest demanded by Manifest Destiny. The war was the brutal military execution of a long-held ideological belief. The military triumph culminated in the Treaty of Guadalupe, signed in February 1848. The treaty formalized the American victory and represented the largest single land acquisition in U.S. history since the Louisiana Purchase. The terms were punitive for Mexico. Cession. Mexico agreed to cede its northern territories, comprising all of present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, to the United States. This area, known as the Mexican Cession, totaled approximately 525,000 square miles, 1.36 million square kilometers.
Border recognition. Mexico formally accepted the U.S. claim of the Rio Grande as the boundary with Texas. Payment. In exchange for this immense territory, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, the exact sum paid for the Louisiana Purchase 45 years earlier. The U.S. also agreed to assume $3.25 million in claims that American citizens held against the Mexican government. The payment was intended to soften the image of conquest, allowing Polk to claim the war was not purely about land seizure. The acquisition was monumental, stretching the United States to the Pacific Ocean, fulfilling the geographic dream of continental expansion. However, even this immense territory was not enough for the zealots of Manifest Destiny, who, briefly, agitated for the acquisition of all Mexico movement. The final small piece of the puzzle came 5 years later with the Gadsden Purchase, 1853. The U.S. paid Mexico another $10 million for a small, strategically important strip of land in what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico. This was primarily intended as the route for a transcontinental railroad that proponents believed would link the acquired Pacific territories seamlessly to the Eastern economy. With the Gadsden Purchase, the territorial boundaries of the contiguous 48 states of the United States were essentially finalized, achieving the continental scale imagined by Manifest Destiny.
The triumph of Manifest Destiny was simultaneously the doom of American unity. The vast, newly acquired territory, the Mexican Cession, irrevocably reopened the most volatile political question: would the new lands be free or slave? The acquisition of millions of square miles shattered the fragile equilibrium maintained by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Northern abolitionists and free soilers were aghast at the prospect of the slave power expanding across the continent, while Southern fire-eaters insisted that slaveholders had the constitutional right to take their property, slaves, anywhere in the newly acquired territories. The ideology of expansion, which was supposed to unite the nation under a shared purpose, instead acted as a powerful accelerant to the sectional crisis. The conflict immediately manifested in the Wilmot Proviso, 1846. David Wilmot, a Pennsylvania congressman, proposed that slavery be explicitly prohibited in all territory acquired from Mexico. Though the proviso repeatedly passed the House, reflecting Northern population advantage, and failed in the Senate, reflecting Southern power, it became the defining issue of the decade. It forced every politician in the nation to declare a position on slavery's expansion, proving that any new land acquired would lead to an agonizing and divisive political crisis. The situation spiraled into a national emergency during the California Gold Rush, 1849. The sudden massive influx of population to California, spurred by the discovery of gold, allowed it to bypass the territorial stage and apply for statehood almost immediately. The Californians, primarily Northerners and immigrants, drafted a constitution that prohibited slavery. This proposal threatened to upset the delicate balance of 15 free states and 15 slave states in the Senate. The crisis of 1850 required the intervention of the great compromiser, Henry Clay, to avert civil war. The resulting Compromise of 1850 was a desperate attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable demands of Manifest Destiny and slavery. California was admitted as a free state. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was banned in Washington, D.C. The South received a much stricter Fugitive Slave Act, making it a federal crime to assist escaped slaves and mandating that Northern officials return them to their owners. The remaining territories of New Mexico and Utah were organized under the principle of popular sovereignty, meaning the residents themselves would vote on the issue of slavery, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise line. This complex, painful compromise merely delayed the inevitable confrontation. Manifest Destiny had achieved its territorial goal, but at the cost of national unity. The acquisition of land was not a unifying act of destiny, it was a Trojan horse that brought the virus of sectionalism to the entire continent, setting the final, inevitable trajectory toward civil war a decade later. The price of continental expansion was national fragmentation. By the mid-1850s, Manifest Destiny had physically achieved its primary objective.
the United States spanned the continent. However, the true, lasting legacy of the ideology lay not just in the maps, but in the profound, often tragic transformation of the continent itself. For the indigenous peoples, manifest destiny was not destiny, it was catastrophic displacement. The doctrine, rooted in racial superiority, justified the policy of Indian removal and the subsequent Indian Wars in the West. The new territories provided the logistical space to enact the final solution, forcing the Plains tribes onto smaller reservations and clearing the path for the railroad and mass settlement. Tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Apache, who had managed their vast territories for centuries, now faced an existential threat backed by a relentless, continent-spanning government. The cost of manifest destiny was measured in broken treaties, decimated populations, and cultural ruin, a debt the nation would wrestle with for generations. For the environment, the ideological drive for use and possession led to massive ecological transformation. The vision of a boundless, inexhaustible continent was shattered by the reality of aggressive resource extraction. Farmers rushed to till the fertile river valleys, lumberjacks ravaged the immense forests of the Pacific Northwest, and miners brutally scarred the mountains of California and Nevada in pursuit of gold and silver. The belief that resources were limitless, a core assumption of manifest destiny, led to rapid and destructive depletion of natural capital, foreshadowing the conservation movements that would eventually emerge to save what little remained of the untouched West. For the national character, manifest destiny solidified a sense of American exceptionalism, the conviction that the U.S. had a unique and superior role to play in world history. This continental victory provided a seemingly divine validation of the American experiment, yet it also instilled a dangerous tradition of unilateralism and aggression, rooted in the success of the Mexican-American War, where territorial gain was achieved through manufactured conflict. In conclusion, manifest destiny was the defining spirit of the antebellum republic. It began as a hopeful spiritual justification for expansion, successfully driving the United States from a coastal republic to a continental empire. But the final irony was that the very success of the ideology, the acquisition of a continent, carried within it the seeds of national destruction, forcing the nation to confront the moral cancer of slavery that the land could no longer contain. It made the U.S. whole geographically, only to tear it apart politically, setting the final, inevitable stage for the Civil War a decade later. The ideology of manifest destiny, galvanized by the Louisiana Purchase and the exploratory narratives of Lewis and Clark and the Mountain Men, needed a physical manifestation, a human engine to transform abstract claim into undeniable possession. That engine was the Great Migration. Beginning in the early 1840s, a relentless tide of humanity, driven by a cocktail of economic desperation, religious fervor, and romantic idealism, began its slow, grueling march across the American interior. The routes they forged, primarily the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail, along with later branches like the California Trail, became the indelible arteries of American expansion, binding the Pacific to the eastern states not by law, but by sweat and shared sacrifice.
The motivations for undertaking the 2,000-mile journey were varied but universal in their intensity. Economically, the Panic of 1837 had devastated many small farmers in the Midwest, particularly those in states like Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa. Land was depleted, debt was high, and the lure of free, fertile, and seemingly limitless land in the Oregon country was irresistible. Missionary zeal also played a powerful role. Protestant groups, especially Methodists, sought to save the indigenous populations of the Pacific Northwest, believing their presence was necessary to bring both Christianity and American civilization to the territory before the British consolidated their claim. The journey was popularized by deeply influential literature. Accounts from early missionaries like Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, combined with government reports, painted the Oregon Territory as a verdant paradise of rich soil and perpetually mild climate, a perfect haven for the industrious farmer.
Oregon fever became a national epidemic, transforming the dangerous 2,000-mile trek into a romantic quest for prosperity. The Santa Fe Trail, by contrast, was primarily a commercial highway. It began in Independence, Missouri, and stretched 900 miles southwest to Santa Fe, the capital of Mexico's New Mexico province. It was not intended for mass settlement, but for profit. American traders packed their wagons with manufactured goods, textiles, hardware, tools, and luxury items, and hauled them across the plains to trade for Mexican silver, furs, and mules. This trail was the first significant bridge between the American and Hispanic economies, forging a path of commerce that predated and eventually catalyzed military conquest. Both the Oregon and Santa Fe trails, despite their different objectives, served the same strategic purpose: asserting an undeniable, permanent American presence in territories still legally claimed by Great Britain and Mexico. The migration was, in essence, an unarmed invasion, driven by the belief that where Americans settled, the American flag must inevitably follow. The gateway to the west was the small, bustling town of Independence, Missouri, situated at the extreme western edge of the American frontier. By the early 1840s, this dusty outpost transformed annually into a chaotic, temporary metropolis every spring. Settlers, often entire families selling everything they owned to finance the journey, gathered here, creating a vibrant yet anxious community of the determined and the desperate. The timing of departure was crucial. Travelers had to leave Independence between late April and early May. Leaving earlier meant facing impassable mud, swollen rivers, and scarce grass for the livestock. Leaving later risked being caught in the high mountain passes, the Rockies, and the Cascades during the deadly early winter snows. This narrow, unforgiving window dictated the logistics of the entire migration. Organization was paramount for survival. The journey was too dangerous for individual families. The settlers quickly adopted the organizational structure of the wagon train. These were self-governing, temporary communities that could range from 20 to over 100 wagons. Upon forming, the emigrants drafted a set of bylaws, elected a captain, often an experienced frontier traveler or a respected elder, and established guard duties and travel protocols. Though the captain held authority in matters of defense and travel speed, the wagon train operated on rough frontier democracy, debating serious issues like discipline or route changes. The iconic vehicle of the migration was not the large, cinematic Conestoga wagon, too heavy for the trails, but the smaller, lighter prairie schooner, a modified farm wagon with a canvas cover designed to handle the rough terrain. These wagons were not primarily for riding, they were for hauling supplies. Most travelers, including women, children, and the elderly, walked the entire 2,000 miles, averaging 15 to 20 miles a day. The pace of the livestock dictated the pace of the people. Success hinged entirely on meticulous planning, stocking enough flour, coffee, sugar, and dried meat for 5 to 6 months, and most importantly, acquiring strong, reliable oxen or mules, which were far more robust than horses for pulling heavy loads over long distances. The spring gathering in Independence was the last chance to acquire essential provisions, repair equipment, and confront the brutal realities of the journey before setting off into the terra incognita. The Oregon Trail was the longest and most famous of the overland routes, a 2,000-mile ribbon of ambition stretching from Missouri to the Willamette Valley. After leaving Independence, the emigrants followed the Platte River, a shallow, mile-wide, silt-laden waterway which served as their highway for much of the Great Plains. The trail was marked by an eerie procession of common landmarks that offered a temporal and geographical roadmap. Fort Kearny, the first major military post, offering a brief respite and final opportunity for communication with the east. Chimney Rock, a solitary spire of rock that served as the first unmistakable sign of the approaching western landscape. Independence Rock, a massive granite dome in Wyoming, so named because emigrants aimed to reach it by July 4th to ensure they were on schedule to clear the mountain passes before winter. Thousands of travelers carved their names and dates onto this register of the desert. The major geographical obstacle was the Rocky Mountains. The trail did not attempt to cross the high, treacherous peaks like those that defeated Lewis and Clark. Instead, it followed a critical, subtle geographical feature, the South Pass in Wyoming. Discovered by fur trappers decades earlier, this was a wide, gentle depression in the Continental Divide, so gradual that a traveler might cross it without realizing they had reached the highest point of the journey. The discovery and utilization of the South Pass transformed the Rockies from an insurmountable barrier into a manageable obstacle, making the mass migration viable. Life on the trail was a paradoxical blend of monotony and terror. Day after day, week after week, the routine was the same. Up before dawn, drive the animals, walk through the dust, set up camp, and stand guard. The greatest psychological challenge was the dust, which choked the travelers, ruined food, and coated every possession. The greatest physical threat, however, was not Native American attack, though this fear was pervasive, but disease. Cholera, caused by contaminated water sources, often near contaminated campsites, was the deadliest killer. In the peak years of migration, 1849 to 1852, it is estimated that 1 in 10 people who started the trip died, with a vast, mournful graveyard stretching the length of the trail. The dead were quickly buried in shallow graves, often covered with rocks to protect them from scavengers, leaving behind a solemn, anonymous toll in the history of Western expansion. Upon reaching the Willamette Valley, those who survived had not just traveled 2,000 miles, they had been forged into a new kind of American, self-reliant and possessing an unshakable belief in their own endurance.
In contrast to the Oregon Trail's settler-driven migration, the Santa Fe Trail was a pure engine of early American global trade. Launched initially by William Becknell in 1821, the trail quickly became a lucrative commercial link between the U.S. and the northern provinces of Mexico. The route, about 900 miles long, was shorter and drier than the Oregon Trail, often running directly through treacherous high plains and across the parched Cimarron Desert. The Santa Fe Trail presented a different set of challenges: drought and thirst. Unlike the Oregon Trail, which followed rivers, the Santa Fe Trail often required large, difficult stretches across arid land, where water was scarce. The dry climate made the route faster but riskier, demanding specialized knowledge of rare springs and water holes. Comanche and Apache encounters. The trail traversed the ancestral hunting grounds of the fiercely territorial Comanche and Apache nations, who viewed the heavily laden American caravans as both a military threat and a source of valuable plunder, especially horses and mules. Unlike the Oregon Trail, where contact was often initially peaceful or limited, the Santa Fe Trail saw frequent and organized raids, forcing the caravans to travel under heavy guard and occasionally requiring escort from the U.S. Army. Geopolitical instability. The trail operated entirely within Mexican territory for much of its history, making the American traders subject to Mexican laws, tariffs, and political instability. The success of the Santa Fe Trail lay in the massive economic exchange it facilitated. American manufactured goods were technologically superior and cheaper than Mexican or Spanish alternatives, creating huge demand in Santa Fe, Chihuahua, and other northern Mexican cities. The American traders, in turn, returned east with high-quality mules, essential for southern plantations and farms, silver coinage, and gold dust. The profits were spectacular, often 100% or more on the cost of goods. This commercial artery was paradoxically the most significant initial source of cultural exchange and, later, conflict. It introduced American influence, language, and economic structures deep into Mexican society decades before the military invasion. American traders established residency, learned Spanish, and married into prominent norteño Mexican families, creating a hybrid culture on the frontier.
However, this economic dominance also bred resentment and suspicion among Mexican authorities, who recognized that the trail was slowly pulling their northern provinces into the economic orbit of the United States. When the Mexican-American War finally erupted in 1846, the Santa Fe Trail served as the instant invasion route for General Kearny's forces, who marched unopposed into Santa Fe, having been guided by American traders who knew the territory intimately. The commercial conquest paved the way for the military and political conquest. The overland trails demanded an immense, unforgiving human toll. The popular perception focuses on heroism and adventure, but the reality was often one of grinding misery, loss, and the ultimate test of human endurance. The price of progress. The most accurate estimates suggest that roughly 20,000 emigrants died on the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails between 1840 and 1860, a rate of about 10 fatalities per mile of the combined routes. The trail was a vast, continuous graveyard. As noted, cholera was the great decimator, but accidents were common and gruesome, being crushed by wagon wheels, accidental self-inflicted gunshots, drowning in treacherous river crossings, the Platte, the Snake, the Columbia, and exhaustion. The physical labor required to dismantle, ferry, and reassemble wagons across major rivers was a constant and terrifying risk. The trail did not discriminate. It claimed young, old, strong, and weak alike. The need to bury loved ones quickly and often secretly to protect the bodies from wolves and scavengers added a profound psychological trauma to the journey. The resilience of women. While men primarily worried about land, livestock, and defense, the burden of maintaining civilization on the trail fell largely to women. They were expected to manage the constant, back-breaking domestic labor, cooking over buffalo chip fires, wood was often non-existent, washing clothes, and nursing the ill, all while walking the same 2,000 miles as the men. The journey often stripped away the rigid gender rules of the East. Women frequently drove wagons, hunted small game, and even helped push the wagons up steep inclines. Their diaries provide the richest, most detailed accounts of the emotional and social stress of the migration, documenting the exhaustion, the grief, and the quiet dignity of their daily struggle. Their resilience was foundational to the success of the settlements they would eventually establish in the far west. Frontier democracy. The necessity of survival forced the emigrants to practice a rough, immediate form of democracy. The elected wagon train captain was a figure of authority only so long as he retained the confidence of the emigrants. Disputes over livestock management, rationing, or discipline were settled through open communal debate and vote. This process reinforced the American cultural belief in self-government and established an important precedent for the eventual political structures of the Western territories. It was a democracy born of necessity, where rules were pragmatic and justice was swift, designed to ensure the survival of the group above all else. The long journey filtered the population, selecting for the physically resilient, the emotionally steadfast, and the politically collaborative. From the perspective of the indigenous nations, the arrival of the wagon trains was not a migration, it was an ecological and existential crisis. The trails ran directly through the core territories and hunting grounds of the Pawnee, Sioux, Shoshone, and Comanche. Ecological destruction. The massive, continuous influx of wagons and livestock had an immediate devastating effect on the environment. The massive herds of oxen and mules consumed the vital grasses and depleted the few water sources along the trail corridor. This ecological destruction directly impacted the primary food source of the Plains tribes, the buffalo. The disappearance of grazing land and the disturbance of migratory patterns contributed to the decimation of the buffalo herds, an action that was soon to be deliberately accelerated by U.S. policy. Disease transmission. Like earlier European contact, the wagon trains brought highly contagious diseases, cholera, measles, and smallpox, for which the native people had no immunity. These epidemics often ravaged indigenous communities near the trails, contributing significantly to their population decline and cultural destabilization, sometimes even before settlers engaged in direct conflict. Conflict over resources. Initially, contact was often marked by trading. Native groups provided guides, fresh meat, and assistance in exchange for flour, iron tools, and occasionally rifles. However, as the herds of emigrant livestock and the waste they left behind increased, the interactions quickly devolved into violent competition for resources. The Comanche, for instance, transitioned from trading partners to fierce armed protectors of their territories, seeing the travelers as thieves and trespassers. The U.S. government, desperate to maintain the flow of settlers and thus secure the territory, began to intervene militarily. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was the first major attempt to impose artificial order. The government promised Native nations annual payments and territorial boundaries in exchange for their pledge not to harass the emigrants. While this treaty temporarily secured the trail, it formalized the concept that the American government, not the Native nations, held ultimate authority over the land, a claim that would be systematically ignored by settlers and later violently enforced by the U.S. Army, leading directly to the Plains Wars. The trails were thus the precursor to the devastating conflicts that would define the post-Civil War West. By the 1850s, the Great Migration had achieved its strategic goal. The sheer number of Americans in Oregon and California, especially after the 1849 gold rush, made those territories irrevocably American. The U.S. government quickly asserted control. Oregon became a territory in 1848 and a state in 1859. The trails had delivered the critical demographic majority that turned manifest destiny into a geographic reality. However, the trails themselves began to change rapidly. The continuous movement of hundreds of thousands of people resulted in the establishment of permanent staging posts, ferries, and roadhouses along the routes, transforming the difficult wilderness journey into a slightly more predictable, albeit still perilous, commercial enterprise. The U.S. Army established permanent forts along the routes, like Fort Laramie and Fort Bridger, not just to protect emigrants from native raids, but increasingly to police the native population itself and mediate the escalating conflicts over land and resources.
The ultimate demise of the long-distance wagon trains was brought about by the same engine of expansion they helped create, technology. The invention of the telegraph provided instant communication across the continent by 1861, immediately eliminating the need for the Pony Express and other rapid mail services. More critically, the outbreak of the Civil War momentarily slowed the migration, but the post-war drive for national unity and commercial dominance led to the massive federal commitment to the Transcontinental Railroad. When the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, the age of the Overland Trail effectively ended. The arduous, 6-month journey was suddenly condensed into a matter of days, shifting the flow of people and goods from the wagon wheel to the iron rail. While the spirit of the pioneer endured, the trail itself was eclipsed. The legacy of the Great Migration was sealed. It was the singular human effort that physically tied the continent together, proving that where American ambition saw an obstacle, American endurance would forge a path. The trails created the first true American empire, built on the backs of ordinary farmers and traders who risked everything for the promise of the Far West. The decision to join the Great Migration was personal, born of desperation or desire. The act of survival, however, was strictly communal. No single family, no matter how well-equipped or resourceful, could hope to conquer the 2,000-mile stretch of the overland trails alone. The solution was the wagon train, a temporary, mobile micro-society built on shared risk and necessity. These trains, which could range from a dozen to over 100 wagons, were the organizational marvels of the Western migration, transforming chaotic individualism into structured survival.
The formation process began in the staging areas of Independence, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs during the critical spring preparation window. Families coalesced, often based on geography, religious affiliation, or simply chance encounter. Once formed, the group's first, most crucial act was the establishment of civil order. They drafted simple, binding bylaws, a frontier constitution that governed everything from the morning routine to the rules of defense and the adjudication of disputes. This process was pure, immediate frontier democracy. The rules were pragmatic. No one could leave the train without a majority vote. Guard duties were mandatory, and the pace of the slowest team often dictated the pace of the whole. The supreme figure was the captain. This leader was not necessarily the wealthiest or most educated, but usually the most experienced frontiersman, hunter, or military veteran. The captain was elected, and his authority rested entirely on his ability to maintain order, spot danger, and navigate the relentless demands of the trail. His power was constantly tested. A single poor decision, a wrong turn leading to a dry campsite, a delayed crossing, or a failure to maintain discipline could lead to his immediate impeachment and replacement by popular vote. The wagon train was therefore a crucible of American democracy, where leadership was transactional and performance-based, stripped down to its most brutal effectiveness. The logistics of the train were unforgiving. The ideal pace was 15 to 20 miles per day, 6 days a week, a pace necessary to reach the mountain passes before the snow fell. The most crucial factor was the draft animals. Oxen were the preferred choice over horses and mules. Though slower, oxen were stronger, cheaper, less prone to being stolen by native tribes, and critically, their hooves were tougher, less prone to injury, and they could sustain themselves on the coarse prairie grasses that mules and horses would reject. The wagons, typically prairie schooners, modified farm wagons, rather than the heavy, cumbersome Conestogas, were loaded with an astonishing array of necessities: 200 pounds of flour per person, 150 pounds of bacon, coffee, sugar, dried fruits, and essential tools. Every item, however, was a physical burden. Over the course of the journey, as exhaustion set in and the animals weakened, the trails became tragically marked by the trail of discarded goods, cast iron stoves, antique furniture, books, and family heirlooms, all ruthlessly abandoned to lighten the load and ensure survival. This abandonment was a powerful psychological ritual, signifying the total shedding of the Eastern past in favor of the Western future. The experience of the trek was not of constant heroism, but of grinding, soul-crushing routine. The rhythm of the trail was a tyranny, dictated by the needs of the animals and the movement of the sun. The day began around 4 a.m., sometimes earlier, with the wake-up call of the bugle or the captain's shout. The first task, before even breakfast, was rounding up the animals, a task often delayed by stampedes or losses to wolves or thieves. The women quickly built fires, often fueled by the only available source in the treeless plains, buffalo chips. These chips, though odorless and efficient, were a daily, humiliating reminder of the distance from civilization. Breakfast was swift and basic, usually coffee, bacon, and leftover biscuits. By 6 a.m., the process of yoking the teams and packing the wagons began, a laborious, noisy, and often frustrating affair. The train was supposed to be in motion by 7 a.m. For the next 6 to 8 hours, the procession moved slowly, covering the 15 to 20 miles necessary for the day's progress. The pace was agonizingly slow, dictated by the oxen. Most men, women, and older children walked beside the wagons to spare the animals, enduring the relentless billowing dust. The fine, choking powder, kicked up by thousands of hooves and dozens of wheels, coated hair, clothes, food, and throats, causing persistent coughs and eye infections. Midday brought a brief, hurried stop, usually only lasting an hour, to allow the animals to graze and the emigrants to eat a cold lunch. The afternoon march was often the most difficult, as the sun was at its highest and the dust at its worst. As the sun began to dip, the train halted, and the immediate work of survival began anew. Making camp was a meticulously choreographed exercise in self-defense and domestic order.
Wagons were immediately drawn into a tight circle, or corral, for two primary reasons. First, to create an immediate defensive perimeter against any potential threat, and second, and more importantly, to securely pen the thousands of head of livestock inside for the night. While the men tended to the animals, the women prepared the evening meal, the one substantial meal of the day, before the setting sun. After dinner, the only social life emerged: brief campfire gatherings, religious singing, or the settling of disputes. Guard duty was assigned and enforced throughout the night. The absolute silence of the vast prairie, broken only by the howl of a wolf or the cry of a guard, was often as unnerving as the day's constant noise. This unyielding cycle, repeated over 150 days, turned the travelers into automatons, prioritizing the necessary routine over every human comfort. The most common narrative of the trail focuses on armed conflict with Native Americans. The true reality is that the true enemy was disease. The wagon trains were not just moving settlements, they were mobile petri dishes, spreading sickness faster than any frontier fire. Cholera was the greatest killer, earning the route the moniker, the longest graveyard in the world.
The cholera epidemic, which peaked in the late 1840s and early 1850s, was a terrifying mystery to the emigrants. It was caused by bacteria in contaminated water, often spread when polluted runoff from campsites entered the same river that served as the primary source of drinking water downstream. Its onset was sudden, brutal, and often fatal within hours. Victims experienced severe vomiting, debilitating diarrhea, and rapid dehydration, turning them bluish-gray, blue cholera, before death. Doctors were powerless. The only remedies available, opium and potent laxatives, often exacerbated the dehydration. In 1852 alone, it is estimated that over 2,500 people died of cholera on the trails. Other common killers included dysentery, typhoid fever, and the dreaded mountain fever, likely tick-borne relapsing fever. Beyond communicable diseases, accidents were frighteningly frequent and almost always fatal without modern medical care. Crushed by wheels, the massive, heavy, iron-rimmed wagon wheels, weighing hundreds of pounds, were a constant danger, especially when ascending or descending steep inclines. A common tragedy involved a person slipping on the muddy tracks and being instantly crushed. Accidental shootings. The constant presence of firearms, carried by inexperienced frontiersmen, led to frequent accidental discharges. Cleaning a muzzle-loaded rifle or handling powder often ended in a life-ending injury. Drowning at crossings. River crossings were moments of pure terror. The Platte, the Snake, and the Green Rivers were often swift, deep, and heavily silted. A sudden slip, a broken rope, or an overturned wagon could result in immediate drowning for both people and animals. The sheer volume of death transformed the journey into a continuous funeral procession. The etiquette of the trail demanded that burials be swift and silent. To prevent native tribes or scavengers from disturbing the graves, the bodies were often buried at night, away from the trail, covered with heavy rocks, and the wagon train would drive livestock over the site to obscure the evidence. The dead were left behind anonymously, their graves marked only by the collective memory of the survivors, creating a mournful, invisible trail of tears that stretched across the Great Plains. The relentless visible evidence of death, discarded belongings, abandoned wagons, and the silent graves served as a constant crushing reminder that the journey was not just a rite of passage, but a life or death selection process. The wagon trains faced three fundamental geographical challenges that tested the limits of their endurance: the rivers, the deserts, and the mountains. These obstacles were not merely inconveniences, they were potential journey enders that required specialized, risky logistical maneuvers. The Great Water Barriers. The major rivers served as both lifelines and death traps. The Platte River was the emigrants' highway for hundreds of miles, but its character was deceptive. A mile wide and inch deep, containing treacherous quicksand, hidden deep channels, and a massive churning current.
The crossing of the Snake, Green, and particularly the Columbia River in the final stages of the Oregon Trail often required highly dangerous techniques. Wagons were frequently dismantled and rebuilt, or in the case of deep crossings, were caulked. The wagon boxes were sealed with tar and pitch to make them watertight, turning them into temporary makeshift ferry boats. This process was extremely slow, often requiring days of manual labor, and posed the ever-present threat of drowning or losing essential supplies. Delays at major crossings often stacked up, creating bottlenecks where disease and impatience flared and adding stress to the critical timeline. The deserts and the logistics of water. The most terrifying challenge was the scarcity of water, particularly on the Cimarron cutoff of the Santa Fe Trail and the vast, dry stretches leading to California and Oregon. The Cimarron cutoff, though shorter, required traversing a 60-mile stretch without water, a journey that could kill the livestock within days if miscalculated. Wagons had to be loaded with barrels of water, and the pace was pushed to the absolute limit. In the arid terrain, the emigrants faced sunstroke, dehydration, and the agonizing necessity of sacrificing animals that were too weak to continue. The sight of a dead animal meant the entire load was in jeopardy, forcing the difficult decision of redistributing the load or abandoning irreplaceable supplies. The mountain passes. The final hurdle was the mountain ranges. The South Pass in Wyoming was a blessing, a wide, gradual ramp over the Continental Divide. But beyond lay the brutal, snow-filled passes of the Rockies, like the Donner Pass on the California Trail, or the final treacherous crossings of the Cascades and Sierra Nevada. The goal was simple: clear the mountains by mid-October. Failure meant certain disaster. The infamous fate of the Donner Party in 1846, trapped by early snow in the Sierra Nevada, became the frontier's ultimate cautionary tale, a gruesome reminder of the unforgiving nature of the mountain environment and the brutal consequences of logistical failure. Wagon wheels were removed, and the wagons were often dragged, lifted, and lowered through ropes through terrain where every inch of progress was a battle against gravity and time. The narrative of the American pioneer often centers on the bearded, rifle-toting man guiding the wagon. Yet the physical and psychological success of the migration rested squarely on the silent, continuous labor of women and children. Their toil was ceaseless, and their burden was arguably heavier, as they were tasked with maintaining the fragile framework of civilized life amid the chaos of the wilderness. The double burden. Women were expected to perform all the domestic duties they had in the East, but under the most impossible conditions, and all while walking 15 to 20 miles per day. They walked to conserve the strength of the oxen. When arriving at the campsite, while the men tended to the livestock, the women immediately began the evening's work, gathering buffalo chips, starting the fire, fetching water, preparing the evening meal, often baking bread in Dutch ovens buried in hot embers, and tending to the sick. Laundry was a Herculean task, often done only once a week in polluted river water, further contributing to the spread of disease. Diaries reveal the profound weariness of this double day, walking all day and then managing the entire domestic sphere at night, a relentless 24-hour cycle of work. Guardians of morale and culture. Beyond physical labor, women carried the invisible burden of morale. They were the nurturers, the nurses, and the teachers. They were responsible for maintaining a sense of home, often bringing small relics, books, or mementos to remind the children of the civilization they had left behind. In a world defined by the relentless pursuit of land, women provided the crucial emotional anchor. Their diaries, unlike the terse, matter-of-fact journals kept by men, which focused on mileage and weather, are rich historical documents detailing the emotional toll, the grief of burying children, the loneliness of the prairie, and the moments of shared female solidarity that made the journey bearable.
The experience of children. Children on the trail were not passengers, they were laborers. Young boys were often tasked with herding livestock, an immensely challenging job that required them to ride ahead of the main train, risking ambush or stampede.
Girls were critical assistants to their mothers, responsible for gathering fuel and water and caring for younger siblings. The trail, however, was also a constant source of danger for children. They faced the same risk of disease and the specific dangers of wandering too far from the train or being crushed under the heavy wheels during the day. The experience rapidly stripped away childhood innocence, demanding adult responsibility and resilience from ages as young as 6 or 7. Many of the graves dotting the trails belonged to children. The entire family structure, the bedrock of Eastern society, was tested to its breaking point, and only those trains where labor and suffering were truly shared survived intact. The women and children who completed the journey were not survivors, but co-conquerors. Their unrecognized labor foundational to the final settlement of the West. The constant physical stress and the relentless proximity of the wagon train created an environment ripe for social friction and psychological breakdown. The wagon train was a community of strangers, bonded only by a temporary necessity, and the journey mercilessly exposed the flaws in character, leadership, and planning. The breakdown of social norms. The democratic rules established in independence often dissolved under pressure. Arguments over water rights, grazing territory for the animals, or accusations of theft could escalate quickly into violence. The most common and divisive friction arose over the speed of travel. Families with fast-moving mules resented being held back by the slow pace of the oxen teams, leading to splits and fragmentation of the original train. A split was a dangerous choice, as smaller groups were more vulnerable to attack and less capable of sharing labor and defense, but often the internal conflict proved more unbearable than the external threats. The captain's most taxing duty was not fighting Indians, but maintaining harmony among the immigrants. The psychological abyss. Beyond internal conflict lay the crushing psychological toll of isolation and sensory deprivation. For weeks, the immigrants saw nothing but the vast, silent, and often featureless expanse of the prairie, broken only by the occasional distant herd of buffalo or the grim procession of abandoned wagons. The sheer scale of the landscape diminished the individual, fostering a deep sense of loneliness and insignificance. The constant fear of cholera, fear of stampedes, fear of being caught in the mountains, and the ever-present, though often exaggerated, fear of native attacks created a state of chronic high alert that frayed nerves and strained marriages. Sleep was rarely restful, and the lack of privacy in a tight-knit camp meant there was no escape from the anxiety of the group. The trail of abandonment. The physical act of abandonment served as a powerful psychological marker. As the journey progressed, a point of no return was reached, typically around Fort Laramie. By this point, turning back was often more dangerous than pressing forward. Here, the decision to jettison non-essential items became frequent and brutal. The trail west of Laramie was famously littered with hundreds of abandoned wagons, tools, and heavy food items discarded not out of malice, but out of the cold, hard realization that survival meant sacrificing comfort and wealth. This ritual of abandonment was a stark lesson in true necessity, stripping the immigrant of their material past and redefining their worth solely by their ability to endure. Ultimately, the surviving immigrants who arrived in the Willamette Valley or California in the autumn were fundamentally changed. They had faced down death, disease, and the fracturing demands of communal life. They were a self-selected population, forged by the brutal efficiency of the trail. The wagon train, in its short, painful existence, was the ultimate refining fire, determining not only who would survive to settle the West, but what kind of American they would become: tough, resilient, deeply pragmatic, and forever defined by the memory of the immense hardship overcome on the Great Migration. The trek west was not a holiday. It was a 5-month-long war against nature, time, and the fragility of the human spirit. The wagon train, having conquered the rivers and the mountains, finally stopped. The Great Migration was a journey of relentless motion. The establishment of a frontier town was an act of abrupt, stubborn stasis. A town was not planned, it erupted, a spontaneous combustion of tents, rough-sawn lumber, and ambitious desperation. It might coalesce around a newly discovered gold strike, a boom town, a critical river crossing, a ferry town, or the head of a cattle trail, a cow town. But regardless of its genesis, the frontier settlement was America's most volatile social experiment, defined by its speed, its impermanence, and the immediate, terrifying vacuum of central authority. The transition from the collective discipline of the wagon train to the individual chaos of the town was jarring. On the trail, rules were clear, the captain's word was law, and the group's survival was paramount. In the new settlement, the rules vanished. Land was free for the taking, or so the settlers believed. Resources were up for grabs, and the nearest established court or federal marshal might be hundreds of miles away. The social contract was stripped bare, exposing the raw human elements of ambition, greed, and violence. The frontier town became the crucible where three defining forces of the western frontier clashed and coexisted. Land, the obsession with ownership, leading to rampant speculation, claim disputes, and the constant threat of eviction or theft. Land was wealth, and the boundary lines were often drawn in blood. Lawlessness, the inevitable vacuum created by the absence of organized government, leading to the necessary but dangerous rise of self-appointed justice, vigilante committees, and constant personal peril. Lore, the immediate, romanticized creation of Western mythology, the gunslinger, the noble savage, the saloon shootout, which quickly superseded the mundane, brutal, and often boring reality of daily pioneer struggle.
The typical frontier town was an architectural mess, a single, wide, dusty street lined with hastily erected structures. The first buildings were almost universally the saloon, the general store, and the land office, or a crude substitute thereof. Civilization followed commerce, and commerce followed the fastest way to extract wealth from the ground and circulate it. These settlements were not built to last, but to exploit. They were temporary nodes in a vast network of extraction, making them inherently volatile and structurally unstable, both physically and socially. The lifespan of a typical boomtown was often shorter than the maturity of the trees cut down to build its initial structures. The fundamental organizing principle of any frontier town was land. The settlers' entire purpose, driven by the ideology of manifest destiny and the economic necessity of the Homestead Act after 1862, was to acquire a piece of the continent. But the process of acquisition was far from orderly. It was a ruthless Darwinian scramble fueled by speculation and deceit. Claim jumping. Before the establishment of official federal land offices and surveys, land claims were often based on crude squatters' rights. A settler would mark out a claim, typically 160 acres, provided by blazing trees or driving stakes, and register it with a local, unofficial claims association. These associations, governed by rough consensus, were the only recognized authority. However, in the absence of legal deeds, the system was ripe for claim jumping, the act of seizing a claim already worked or developed by another settler. Claim jumpers were often ruthless, backed by hired guns or simply the anonymity of the frontier chaos. Disputes over water access, property lines, or mineral rights frequently escalated into lethal confrontations, making the frontier courtroom the nearest patch of open dirt and the jury a crowd of armed witnesses. The role of the speculator. Waiting in the wings were the land speculators. These wealthy Eastern or European investors often possessed capital and political connections, allowing them to acquire large blocks of land through dubious means before the federal land offices opened. They would bribe officials, manipulate survey lines, or purchase claims cheaply from exhausted settlers looking to move on. Once the town established stability, the speculator would sell these parcels at exorbitant profits, preventing the ordinary homesteader from realizing the full economic benefit of their own labor. This practice, while reviled by the honest settler, was a defining characteristic of American capitalism, transferring wealth from the rugged individualist to the well-connected financier. The survey and the law. When the Federal General Land Office, GLO, finally established a presence, it brought with it the rigid geometric order of Jefferson's grid system. The arrival of the GLO surveyor, with his transit and chain, was a moment of profound psychological and legal reckoning.
His lines defined reality. His marks determined economic fortune. For those who settled haphazardly, the official survey often revealed their cabins stood on land claimed by someone else, or worse, on land reserved for the railroad or a future town site. The GLO became a source of both justice, confirming a legitimate claim, and immense heartbreak, invalidating a year's worth of back-breaking labor. The tension between the physical reality of a settler's hard-won improvements and the legal reality of the GLO's map created an inescapable conflict. The promise of free land was often offset by the cost of defending it, legally and physically. The land was not a gift from Providence. It was a prize won in a high-stakes, ruthless game of law, force, and paper trails, ensuring that the wealth of the West accrued most reliably not to those who tilled the soil, but to those who manipulated the deeds. If land was the raw material of the frontier town, then commerce was its lifeblood, conducted often in the most unlikely of places. The frontier economy was defined by two central contrasting institutions: the saloon, the center of vice and liquid capital, and the general store, the anchor of debt and permanent commerce. The saloon, the true town center. The saloon was far more than a drinking establishment. It was the de facto town hall, bank, post office, hotel, and social center. It was usually one of the first structures built, a quick canvas-roofed shack that offered the only respite from the crushing isolation and relentless labor. The saloon provided the necessary illusion of civilization. A bartender, often a man of usual intelligence and neutral disposition, tasked with mediating disputes, and most importantly, liquor, which served as the primary psychological lubricant for a population stressed to its limit. The saloon's real function was financial. It was the site of almost all major transactions. Land deals were struck across its sticky bar top, wages were paid and immediately gambled away at its tables. And miners often converted their gold dust into cash or credit there. Gambling, poker, faro, and three-card monte was not just entertainment. It was a fast, aggressive form of wealth redistribution. The rapid, unpredictable shifts in fortune mirrored the volatile nature of the frontier itself, reinforcing the idea that money was meant to be risked and quickly consumed, rather than saved. The general store, the web of debt. In contrast, the general store was the conservative, permanent anchor of the town. Owned typically by a shrewd businessman with Eastern connections, the store provided every necessity: flour, beans, gunpowder, tools, and the vital paper and ink needed to file claims. The storekeeper was the opposite of the saloon's quick-draw, quick-cash ethos. He was the banker and the debt collector. Most pioneer families operated entirely on credit until their first harvest or their mine paid out. The storekeeper extended that credit, tracking the community's financial health in his ledger book. His control was absolute. He set the prices, he dictated the interest rates, and his ledger book was the ultimate record of a family's solvency. If the farmer failed or the mine dried up, the storekeeper often acquired the land and the remaining livestock. The saloon fostered liquidity and immediate excitement. The general store built lasting wealth through methodical debt accumulation, embodying the fundamental capitalist structure that defined the eventual maturity of the West. The tension between the impulsive spender in the saloon and the calculating storekeeper often defined the social structure of the young town. The most compelling and enduring image of the frontier town is its lawlessness. This was not due to an inherent degeneracy of the settlers, but to a structural failure of governance. The pace of settlement consistently outran the reach of the federal and territorial governments. Sheriffs were few, courts were not existent, and judges were often political appointees hundreds of miles away. This vacuum created an immediate, desperate need for self-appointed justice. The appointed sheriff. The first attempt at formal law enforcement often involved a single appointed marshal or sheriff. These figures were rarely the mythic, fast-drawing heroes of lore. They were often political operators, brawlers, or local strongmen, tasked with maintaining a fragile order. Their authority was based less on legal writ and more on personal intimidation, the size of their gun, and the willingness of the townspeople to back them up. Their job was almost impossible, dealing with disputes over land, settling drunken brawls, and confronting organized gangs of cattle rustlers or bank robbers. all with little to no state funding or backup. Vigilance committees. When official law proved slow, weak, or corrupt, the people resorted to the Vigilance Committee, or vigilantes. This was frontier justice at its most raw and most terrifying. A vigilance committee, typically composed of the town's prominent businessmen and landowners, would form in a crisis, for example, a rash of murders, widespread theft, or a sudden boom of lawlessness. They operated entirely outside the law, holding swift, informal trials and often executing their judgment, usually by hanging within hours or days of the alleged crime. The argument for vigilante justice was pragmatic. In a chaotic environment, swift, overwhelming force was the only way to establish the necessary fear of consequence to protect property. However, the system was inherently unjust. It was often biased against foreigners, particularly Chinese, Irish, or Mexican workers, the poor, and the easily targeted. Vengeance frequently masqueraded as justice, and personal rivalries were settled under the guise of civic duty. The vigilante era, though brutal, was an undeniable step in the evolution of law. It forced the chaos into a structured form, eventually leading the territorial governments to realize they had to establish formal courts and state-funded marshals to replace the instability of the rope and the mob. The struggle between the informal power of the vigilante and the slow, tedious process of the federal court defined the legal history of the mid-19th century West. Long before the town stabilized, they were already being devoured and transformed by the Western lore, the irresistible mythology of the Wild West. This mythology was manufactured in the East, fueled by the insatiable public appetite for adventure and the lucrative business of dime novels. These inexpensive, mass-produced paperbacks sensationalized the daily struggles of the frontier into epic tales of good versus evil. The gunslinger archetype, the dime novels took ordinary men, saloon owners, gamblers, or lawmen forced into occasional violence, and transformed them into demigods of the quick draw. Figures like Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp, who were complex, often flawed, and sometimes morally ambiguous individuals, were instantly polished into faultless heroes fighting for truth and order. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, for instance, was in reality a 30-second-long alley brawl involving political and business rivals. In lore, it became the ultimate showdown between pure law and absolute lawlessness. This transformation was deliberate. The public wanted a simplified moralistic narrative where chaos was defeated by a single heroic figure. The romanticized landscape. The reality of the Great Plains was dust, monotony, and hard labor. The lore recast the landscape as a boundless, majestic canvas of rugged individualism, a place where character was forged, not destroyed by hardship. The mountain men were turned from often illiterate fur trappers who married native women into solitary philosophers of the wilderness. The pioneer woman who spent her days wrestling with cholera and buffalo chips was transformed into the brave, refined schoolmarm who brought civilization to the savage land. The myth served a crucial national purpose. It justified manifest destiny by romanticizing the cost of conquest and providing heroic role models for the next generation of settlers. Buffalo Bill and the Traveling Spectacle. The mythology machine reached its peak with William F. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. Beginning in 1883, Cody's traveling spectacle took the fabricated West to the actual East Coast and even to Europe. His shows featured spectacular, choreographed reenactments of buffalo hunts, stagecoach attacks, and, critically, appearances by actual indigenous chiefs like Sitting Bull. The show blurred the line between history and entertainment, teaching millions of people a version of the West that was pure fiction, designed for thrilling consumption. The real West was disappearing under the weight of fences and railroads, but its myth was becoming immortalized as an international symbol of American identity. The lore was the final triumphant product of the frontier, a carefully constructed narrative that made the brutal lawlessness palatable and the painful land grabs justifiable. The most dramatic manifestation of land lore and lawlessness was the life cycle of the boomtown. These settlements were characterized by rapid, hyper-inflated growth, followed by a swift, often total, collapse, leaving behind the haunting relics of the ghost town. The mining boomtown, Virginia City. The gold and silver strikes in California, Nevada, the Comstock Lode, and Colorado created the ultimate boomtowns. Virginia City, Nevada, born overnight from the immense silver deposits of the Comstock Lode, grew from a few shacks to a bustling city of 25,000 in a decade. It was the epitome of lawlessness and instant wealth. Millionaires were created daily, only to lose everything on the stock exchange or the gambling table. The wealth attracted every stratum of society: miners, financiers, prostitutes, and sophisticated European entertainers. The law was fluid, enforced by gun-toting deputies, and constantly challenged by claim jumpers and labor unrest. But as quickly as the ore was extracted, the town began to decline. When the rich veins of silver played out, the population evaporated almost overnight, leaving behind opulent but empty buildings, a monument to the speed and fragility of resource-based wealth. The cattle town, Abilene, Kansas. The post-Civil War explosion of the Texas cattle industry gave rise to the legendary cow towns. Abilene, Kansas became the first major railhead where Texas longhorns, driven north along the Chisholm Trail, could be loaded onto railroad cars bound for eastern markets. These towns were purely transactional, existing for 3 months a year to cater to the young, reckless, and heavily armed cowboys who had just endured a 1,000-mile cattle drive. Cowtowns were zones of intense lawlessness and vice. Saloons, dance halls, and brothels dominated the street, and gunfire was a nightly occurrence. Law enforcement, often led by figures like Wild Bill Hickok in Abilene, was essentially tasked with managing the chaos, not eliminating it, simply ensuring that the critical flow of cattle and cash was not entirely disrupted. The cowtowns died when the population moved the railheads further west to avoid rising land prices and the encroachment of farming settlers who complained about disease and disturbance.
The agricultural town homesteads. Not all towns were born of sudden wealth. The vast majority of settlements were simple, hard-won agricultural communities. These towns lacked the drama and gunslingers of the cowtowns. Their struggles were slower, chronic, and more profound. Drought, cyclical debt to the general store, and the constant isolation of the prairie. Lawlessness here was less about gunfights and more about petty theft, water disputes, and the constant fear of grasshoppers or crop failure. Yet these slow-growing agricultural towns, built by families and sustained by churches, schools, and the Grange, were the ones that lasted. They embodied the true, enduring spirit of the frontier, slow, methodical, and dedicated to the establishment of permanent civic order, ultimately succeeding where the chaotic, volatile boomtowns failed. The survival of the West depended not on the legendary quick-draw artist, but on the ordinary farmer who remained long after the gold was gone and the cattle had moved on. The chaotic frontier town, with its fleeting wealth and endemic violence, was a necessary stage in the American West's political evolution. It represented the ultimate test of the American capacity for self-governance. The journey from initial lawlessness to stable civic order was slow, painful, and often marked by violence, but it was successful. The federal hand. Ultimately, the chaos of the vigilante era forced the federal government to respond. The establishment of formal territorial governments, complete with federally appointed governors, judges, and marshals, began the slow process of establishing the rule of law. These federal figures often met stiff resistance from local communities, accustomed to their own forms of justice. The enforcement of federal law meant the marginalization of the vigilante committees and the professionalization of law enforcement, replacing the temporary authority of the gun with the permanent authority of the court system. This process was critical for attracting reliable investment and population, as stable laws were a prerequisite for true economic growth. The role of the railroad.
The Transcontinental Railroad was the single greatest factor in taming the lawless frontier town. The railroad imposed its own system of rigid corporate efficiency and law enforcement. Towns that were on the rail line thrived. Towns that were bypassed withered. The railroad brought not just goods and people, but the power of the federal government and eastern capital, demanding a level of stability that was incompatible with perpetual vigilante justice. It connected the towns directly to the organized, settled East, stripping them of their isolation and their unique brand of chaos. The cultural infrastructure. The lasting legacy of the frontier town was found in the institutions established by those who sought permanence. Schools and churches. These structures, often the most carefully constructed and maintained buildings in a community, were the true architects of civilization. They represented a rejection of the saloon's quick wealth and the vigilante's quick justice, prioritizing education, moral order, and community cohesion. The women who organized these institutions ensured that the violent, male-dominated atmosphere of the frontier was gradually replaced by a sustainable social structure built for the next generation. The mythic inheritance. Even as the real lawlessness vanished, the lore remained. The stories of the gunslingers and the heroic sheriffs continued to be told and grew only grander with time, becoming the enduring inheritance of the American cultural identity. The myth of the Wild West, a place where rugged individualism was tested and heroes were forged in fire, overshadowed the historical reality of cooperative labor, land speculation, and endemic disease. This enduring lore serves as a powerful, if inaccurate, national origin story, forever linking the American spirit to the audacity, volatility, and eventual triumph of the frontier towns. The birth of these towns was a chaotic, often heartbreaking process, but it was the necessary step that solidified America's claim to the continent. They were the proving grounds where democracy, capitalism, and violence intermingled to create the political and social landscape of the modern American West. The transition from land grabbed by force to law established by federal authority, and finally to lore embraced by the nation, completed the transformation of the wilderness into the American Republic. The year 1845 marked a tipping point in the American experiment, a moment when the philosophical ambition of manifest destiny collided violently with the legal sovereignty of a neighboring republic. The irresistible force of American expansionism, fueled by a religious fervor to control the entire continent from sea to shining sea, met the immovable object of Mexican territorial integrity. At the heart of this collision was James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States, a man whose entire political career was predicated on a singular, unyielding vision of continental enlargement. Polk, a dedicated Jacksonian Democrat, made no secret of his intentions. He wanted Oregon, and he wanted the vast Mexican territories of California and New Mexico. He was a president of relentless territorial appetite, and he was prepared to manufacture the justification for war. The immediate trigger was the Republic of Texas. After winning its independence from Mexico in 1836, Texas had existed for nearly a decade as a quasi-sovereign nation. Its annexation by the United States in 1845 was immediately seen by Mexico as an act of profound aggression. Mexico had never recognized Texan independence, viewing the territory merely as a rebellious province. Therefore, when the U.S. annexed Texas, Mexico severed diplomatic ties. The annexation, however, was only the first, most visible grievance. The deeper, more inflammatory issue was the border dispute. Texas claimed its boundary extended all the way to the Rio Grande, or Rio Bravo del Norte, a claim that would absorb significant portions of New Mexico, including Santa Fe. Mexico fiercely maintained that the border had always been the Nueces River, positioned 150 miles to the north. The area between the two rivers, a large, valuable tract of land, became the critical military and diplomatic flashpoint, a disputed zone ready to ignite. Polk, committed to the Rio Grande boundary, saw the potential conflict not as a diplomatic hurdle, but as a political opportunity. Before hostilities began, Polk dispatched Special Envoy John Slidell to Mexico City, with a mandate to resolve the crisis through purchase. Slidell was authorized to offer up to $25 million for California and New Mexico, provided Mexico acknowledged the Rio Grande as the Texas border. The Mexican government, already facing internal turmoil and viewing the American demands as a national insult that compounded the annexation of Texas, refused to even receive Slidell. This diplomatic rejection, which Polk interpreted as a direct slight against American honor, gave the expansionists the moral high ground they needed to prepare for war, effectively closing the door to a peaceful resolution and setting the stage for direct military confrontation. The acquisition of territory, for Polk, transcended mere negotiation. It was a matter of national destiny, and any price, including war, was deemed acceptable. With diplomacy exhausted and his territorial ambitions undiminished, President Polk initiated the calculated maneuver that would lead to war. In January 1846, he ordered General Zachary Taylor, known to his troops as Old Rough and Ready, to move his forces, the Army of Occupation, from the Nueces River border down into the disputed territory, right to the northern bank of the Rio Grande, directly opposite the Mexican town of Matamoros. This was a clear, deliberate act of military trespass from the Mexican perspective, placing American troops on land that Mexico claimed as its own. Polk was explicitly positioning his forces in harm's way, waiting for an incident.
The ensuing standoff lasted for weeks. On April 25, 1846, the expected clash occurred. A Mexican cavalry detachment crossed the Rio Grande and ambushed a small patrol of American dragoons led by Captain Seth Thornton, killing 11 American soldiers. Polk immediately seized upon the news, which conveniently reached Washington just as he was drafting a message to Congress recommending a declaration of war based on Mexico's refusal to pay claims and receive his envoy. The ambush, however, provided a much more powerful and immediate justification. Polk delivered his famous message to Congress on May 11, 1846, declaring that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. This assertion, a masterstroke of political framing, was deeply misleading. The blood had been shed in the disputed zone, which Mexico fervently believed was its own sovereign territory. Nonetheless, the message resonated with the expansionist fever of the public. Congress, after intense debate and by a significant majority, voted to declare war on May 13, 1846. The declaration of war, however, was far from universally supported. It instantly exposed the deep, pre-existing sectional and moral divisions within the country. Whigs, especially those from New England, were vehemently opposed, viewing the war as a cynical, unconstitutional land grab designed solely to expand slavery. Future President Abraham Lincoln, then a relatively unknown congressman from Illinois, challenged Polk's narrative directly, demanding to know the spot where American blood had been shed, implying that the attack occurred on land that was legally Mexican. Perhaps the most famous dissenter was Henry David Thoreau, who, rather than paying taxes to a government waging a war he deemed unjust, chose to spend a night in jail. His experience inspired the essay Civil Disobedience, arguing that the individual has a moral duty to defy unjust government laws. The war, therefore, began not only on the physical border of the Rio Grande, but in the intellectual and moral conscience of the nation, exposing the inherent contradiction between the democratic ideals of the United States and the aggressive imperialism of Manifest Destiny. The military strategy employed by the United States was ambitious, utilizing three main theaters of operation: General Taylor's thrust into northern Mexico, General Scott's amphibious invasion of central Mexico, and the almost bloodless conquest of the northern territories, New Mexico and California. The March on Santa Fe. The first objective was New Mexico. General Stephen Watts Kearny was tasked with leading the Army of the West out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and seizing Santa Fe, the capital of New Mexico. Kearny's march across the rugged plains was a monumental logistical feat, covering over 800 miles. He was met not with resistance, but with negotiation. Mexico's governor, fearing the American artillery and the inevitability of defeat, abandoned the city in August 1846 and Kearny's army marched into Santa Fe and claimed the entire New Mexico territory for the United States, all without firing a shot. Kearny established a temporary civil government, attempting to stabilize the region under American rule before continuing his mission. The Pacific Frontier and the Bear Flag Revolt. While Kearny secured New Mexico, events in California unfolded with equal speed and even greater drama, fueled by a small group of American settlers and opportunistic figures. Long before the official war began, American agents and military figures were already encouraging unrest. The key players were Captain John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, a famous explorer and cartographer, and Commodore John Sloat of the U.S. Navy. In June 1846, American settlers in the Sacramento Valley, fearing they would be expelled by Mexican authorities, initiated the Bear Flag Revolt. They seized the Mexican outpost at Sonoma and declared the independent California Republic. The flag, hastily sewn, featured a single star, a grizzly bear, and the words California Republic. The revolt was a short-lived affair. When news of the formal U.S. declaration of war finally reached the Pacific coast in July 1846, Commodore Sloat landed troops and raised the American flag over Monterey. The small, localized revolt was instantly superseded by the larger federal war effort, and the brief California Republic dissolved into American military occupation. Kearny, after securing New Mexico, pressed westward with a small force toward California. He faced minor, scattered resistance from local Mexican California forces, most notably the resistance led by Andres Pico. However, the combined land and sea forces of the Americans, including those commanded by Commodore Robert Stockton, proved overwhelming. By January 1847, with the final surrender of the Californios after the Battle of the San Gabriel River, the entire vast territory of California, from San Diego to the Oregon border, was under firm American control. The conquest of the northern territories was rapid and decisive, largely due to the remote nature of the regions, their sparse Mexican populations, and the lack of military focus from the central Mexican government, which was preoccupied with the invasions in the south. This rapid seizure set the stage for the massive American territorial gains that would later define the war's conclusion. While Kearny and Fremont secured the West, the primary focus of the war rested on the two main invasion forces deep in Mexican territory, beginning with the actions of General Taylor. Taylor, a lifelong soldier and a slaveholder, was the initial star of the war, though his blunt, unorthodox style eventually brought him into conflict with President Polk. Taylor's campaign focused on the region immediately south of the Rio Grande. His first major engagements, the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma in May 1846, were decisive American victories that drove the Mexican forces, commanded by General Mariano Arista, out of the disputed zone and established American supremacy in northern Mexico. These early successes were crucial in rallying public support for the war back home, cementing Taylor's reputation as a national hero. Taylor then pushed further south, culminating in the Battle of Monterey in September 1846. Monterey was a fiercely contested, three-day urban engagement against a well-defended Mexican force. The American army eventually overwhelmed the defenses, but Taylor, in a move that angered Polk, agreed to an 8-week armistice with the defeated Mexican general Pedro Ampudia. Polk, who wanted unconditional surrender and a swift end to the war, viewed the armistice as a political blunder and a military softness that undermined his strategy. Polk's frustration was compounded by Taylor's growing popularity. As a Whig general succeeding in a Democrat-led war, Taylor began to be spoken of as a potential presidential candidate in 1848. Fearing a political rival, Polk began to limit Taylor's resources and shifted the main effort of the war to a new commander, General Winfield Scott. In early 1847, most of Taylor's veteran troops were transferred to Scott's command for the planned invasion of central Mexico, leaving Taylor severely undermanned near Saltillo. Mexican President and General Antonio López de Santa Anna, having seized power again and confident he could defeat the diminished American force, launched a massive attack against Taylor at Buena Vista in February 1847. Despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1, Taylor's army, utilizing superior artillery and entrenched positions, managed to hold the line and inflict a crushing defeat on Santa Anna's forces. The victory at Buenavista was tactically brilliant and political career-making. It cemented Taylor's heroic status, leading directly to his election as president a year later. Ironically, a consequence of a victory Polk had sought to prevent by stripping him of his troops.
With Taylor relegated to garrison duty, the focus shifted to the Central Front under the command of General Winfield Scott, a meticulous strategist known as Old Fuss and Feathers. Scott recognized that capturing the decentralized northern territories was insufficient. The war could only be won by seizing the capital, Mexico City, forcing the Mexican government to negotiate on American terms. Scott's campaign began in March 1847 with the amphibious landing at Veracruz. This operation was the largest seaborne invasion in U.S. history up to that point and was executed with remarkable precision. The city of Veracruz, a crucial port, fell after a 2-week siege. Securing the port provided Scott with his critical supply line, a necessary anchor before beginning the daunting march inland toward the high plateau of the Mexican heartland. The march inland immediately confronted Santa Anna's main army strategically positioned in the mountain pass of Cerro Gordo. In April 1847, utilizing intelligence gathered by Captain Robert E. Lee, then a young engineer, Scott outflanked the Mexican positions by pushing his men through the dense chaparral and rugged terrain previously deemed impassable. The Battle of Cerro Gordo was a rout, resulting in the capture of thousands of Mexican soldiers and crucial supplies. The American victory cleared the path to the Valley of Mexico. Scott paused his advance at Puebla to allow his exhausted troops to rest and to allow a final, futile attempt at diplomatic resolution. When negotiations failed, the final assault on the capital began in August 1847. The Americans faced a series of fortified positions guarding the approaches to the capital, leading to a relentless series of battles. Contreras and Churubusco. In August, Scott's forces broke through heavy Mexican resistance at the battles of Contreras and Churubusco, pushing through the outer defensive lines of the capital. The fighting was fierce, especially at the convent of Churubusco, where the St. Patrick's Battalion, San Patricios, a unit composed primarily of Irish and German Catholic deserters from the U.S. Army who defected to Mexico, fought with particular desperation. Their capture and subsequent execution by the U.S. Army remain one of the war's darkest episodes, highlighting the religious and ethnic tensions within the American ranks. Molino del Rey and Chapultepec. The final, decisive actions came in September. The assault on Molino del Rey, the King's Mill, a foundry and arms depot, was a costly American victory. This led directly to the climactic Battle of Chapultepec, the fortress guarding the western gate to the city. The assault on the castle, defended bravely by Mexican cadets, Los Niños Héroes, the boy heroes, was the final major military action. After the citadel fell, the remaining American forces pushed into the capital. On September 14, 1847, Winfield Scott's army marched into the Plaza de la Constitución, the Zócalo, and raised the Stars and Stripes over the National Palace. Scott had achieved an extraordinary military feat, conquering a foreign capital with a small volunteer army thousands of miles from his supply base. The occupation of Mexico City marked the effective end of the military phase of the war, though peace negotiations would drag on for several more months amidst political chaos in both nations.
The territorial consolidation of the American Southwest was completed 6 years later with the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. Negotiated by James Gadsden, the U.S. paid Mexico another $10 million for a small strategic tract of land encompassing southern Arizona and New Mexico. This land was primarily sought by the U.S. to build a southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad, and its acquisition finalized the current contiguous boundary of the lower 48 American states. The war and its subsequent negotiations solidified the United States as a true continental power. The ink on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was barely dry when the vast arid lands of the Mexican cession were revealed to contain a wealth that dwarfed the $15 million payment. Just 9 days before the treaty was signed, James W. Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in the California foothills. News of the discovery, confirmed in 1849, triggered the massive California gold rush. The human stampede. The gold rush served as a dramatic, sudden acceleration of manifest destiny. The acquisition of the land was one thing. The instant mass migration of over 300,000 people, 49ers, was quite another. California became a chaotic melting pot of Americans from every state, but also a truly international community, drawing immigrants from China, Europe, Chile, and Mexico. This sudden demographic explosion instantly rendered the existing legal and social infrastructure obsolete. The mining camps, being classic boom towns, were characterized by the most extreme forms of lawlessness, claim jumping, and vigilante justice, echoing the chaotic births of the earlier frontier towns, but on a national scale. Cultural conflict and displacement. The American influx immediately resulted in profound cultural clashes with the existing Californio population, Mexican citizens who remained on their ancestral lands. These Californios, operating under the established Mexican legal system of land grants, suddenly found their titles challenged by American squatters, lawyers, and politicians who did not recognize their laws. Through a combination of legal chicanery, extortion, and violence, many Californios were systematically dispossessed of their vast land holdings, often reduced to poverty, despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo's promise to respect their property rights. Furthermore, the American expansion was catastrophic for the indigenous peoples of California and the Southwest. Native populations, already decimated by European diseases, were subjected to organized violence, massacres, and forced displacement as American settlers appropriated their land and resources. The gold rush was, for Native Americans, a period of near genocide, as the federal government often did little to protect them from the relentless, violent demands of the incoming settlers. The Mexican-American War therefore acted as a cultural and demographic pressure cooker. It provided the land, and the gold rush provided the human catalyst, combining to create a violently unsettled society that simultaneously embodied America's greatest economic opportunity and its deepest moral failures regarding race, land rights, and law. The Mexican-American War remains a deeply controversial event in U.S. history, simultaneously hailed as the ultimate triumph of manifest destiny and condemned as an act of calculated aggression and land theft. Geopolitical transformation. The immediate geopolitical legacy was undeniable. The United States had achieved continental supremacy, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, securing critical ports on the West Coast that would define its future as a global maritime power. The $15 million price tag was a small fraction of the immense wealth later extracted from California's gold and the Southwest's silver and agricultural lands. The war transformed America from a sprawling regional republic into a solidified continental empire. The moral and political wound. The enduring fatal legacy of the war, however, was the political trauma it inflicted upon the Union. The acquisition of the Mexican cession injected an insurmountable volume of land into the body politic, forcing the slavery issue into a hyper-polarized, inescapable national debate. The Wilmot Proviso and the subsequent Compromise of 1850 were desperate, failed attempts to bandage the wound. The Mexican-American War served as the primary training ground for the officers who would later lead both the Union and Confederate armies, Grant, Lee, Taylor, Davis, etc. And more importantly, it was the political crucible that accelerated the nation's slide into the Civil War. Future President Ulysses S. Grant would later write of the conflict that he believed it to be one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation, concluding that the Civil War was in part divine punishment for the moral stain of the Mexican conquest. In the end, the war was a pivotal moment where land was seized by force, secured by the law of a treaty, and then swiftly incorporated into the lore of an expanding, heroic nation, even as the ethical cost of that conquest guaranteed a future reckoning in blood. The territorial gains were absolute, but the cost to the soul of the Republic was incalculable. The precise moment that shattered the sleepy pastoral isolation of Mexican California occurred not with a cannon blast, but with a flicker of metallic brilliance in a creek bed. The date was January 24, 1848. The location was Sutter Mill, a sawmill being constructed by Swiss immigrant John Sutter on the American River near Coloma. The discovery was made by a foreman named James W. Marshall, a taciturn carpenter who was inspecting the mill race, the ditch that diverted river water to power the saw. Marshall, stooping low, spied something glinting beneath the clear, cold current. It was gold, pure, unadulterated placer gold. Marshall and Sutter immediately attempted to suppress the news. Sutter, who dreamed of establishing a vast, self-sufficient agricultural empire based on Mexican land grants, feared that a gold rush would ruin his carefully planned agricultural kingdom. Marshall, equally secretive, wanted to protect the potential fortune for himself and his employer. They swore their workers to secrecy. But the sheer volume of the discovery, coupled with the inherent human inability to contain news of sudden immense wealth, made secrecy impossible. A local merchant named Sam Brannan, recognizing the commercial opportunity, validated the discovery, ran through the streets of San Francisco waving a bottle of gold dust and shouted, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. Initially, the local Californian population, Native Americans, Californios, and American settlers, responded. San Francisco, a desolate 200-person village, emptied overnight as clerks, sailors, and journalists abandoned their posts and rushed to the foothills. Ships arriving in the harbor were immediately abandoned by their crews. The local economy ceased to function. The only currency was dust, and the only goal was the riverbed. The decisive moment that transformed this local craze into a global stampede came nearly a year later. President James K. Polk, in his final annual message to Congress in December 1848, officially confirmed the discovery, exhibiting a vial of California gold. This public governmental validation, coming just months after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo officially ceded California to the U.S., had a calculated effect. It legitimized the myth. Polk, eager to justify the costly and controversial Mexican-American War, now offered the nation a tangible reward, a continent acquired, not just for land, but for wealth beyond imagining. The confirmation was the starting gun for the 49ers, the wave of over 300,000 global migrants who, starting in 1849, would tear across the globe to the promise of instant riches. The quiet discovery at Sutter's Mill was not merely a mining event, it was the global launch of the American century.
The frenzy of the gold rush was unique in history, not just for the speed of the diaspora, but for the sheer geographical difficulty of reaching the gold fields. Lacking a transcontinental railroad, the hopeful Argonauts had to choose from 3 immensely perilous routes, each presenting a different blend of risk, cost, and endurance. The Overland Trail, the southern route. For most Americans living in the Midwest and East, the overland route was the preferred path, mirroring the journey taken by the Oregon Trail migrants. Starting from St. Joseph or Independence, Missouri, the journey spanned over 2,000 miles and required 5 to 7 months of relentless travel. The 49ers, however, were less organized and far more desperate than their Oregon predecessors. The trail was choked with over 30,000 wagons in 1849 alone, leading to massive logistical failures, overgrazed pastures, depleted water sources, and deadly bottlenecks at river crossings. The wagon trains were mobile hotbeds of cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever, which killed more emigrants than armed conflict. Later extensions, such as the dangerous Hastings Cutoff, infamous for the Donner Party disaster, promised shortcuts, but often delivered tragic detours. While the cheapest route, it was a brutal test of endurance, killing approximately 1 in 10 travelers. The Isthmus of Panama, the rush route. For those seeking speed and willing to pay a higher price, the route through the Isthmus of Panama offered a quicker alternative. This route involved sailing from the east coast to the Atlantic side of Panama, Chagres, a terrifying, disease-ridden trek across the narrow, marshy jungle of the Isthmus, and then catching a second ship on the Pacific side to San Francisco. The Isthmus itself was a gauntlet of tropical nightmares: malaria, yellow fever, high humidity, and dangerous river passages. Upon reaching the Pacific side, migrants often faced months-long delays as there were not enough ships to meet the demand. Prices for passage skyrocketed, leading to desperation and riot. While offering the theoretically fastest route, the Isthmus route was a major commercial gamble and a biological death trap, often leaving travelers stranded and penniless in Central America. Cape Horn, the aristocracy route. The longest but safest route was the voyage around Cape Horn. This involved a 4 to 8 month sea voyage, spanning over 18,000 miles. It was the most expensive and thus often favored by wealthier Easterners or European migrants. While free from the dangers of cholera and overland starvation, the voyage presented its own perils: the treacherous, icy gales and massive waves of the southern tip of South America, followed by the relentless monotony of the Pacific crossing. Upon arrival in San Francisco, the emigrants faced another challenge. The crews of their ships often deserted en masse for the goldfields, leaving hundreds of vessels derelict and abandoned in San Francisco Bay, a literal fleet of ghost ships, symbolizing the sudden abandonment of the known world for the promise of the unknown. Each route, despite the different challenges, delivered the same cargo: a wave of desperate, ambitious men determined to redefine their economic future, transforming a continental problem into a global one. The gold rush created a profoundly distorted demographic reality. The vast majority of those who flooded into California were young, single men, the titular 49ers. These Argonauts, named after the mythological Greek heroes who sought the Golden Fleece, left behind families, stability, and societal constraints. By 1850, the male-to-female ratio in California was an astonishing 10 to 1, and in the mining camps, the ratio could be as high as 50 to 1. This imbalance was the single most defining characteristic of the early gold rush society, creating an instant, temporary culture built on risk, aggression, and profound loneliness. The mining camp was a rough-hewn, volatile social structure. It was an instant meritocracy, where social status was based solely on one's ability to extract gold. Lawyers, doctors, and former slaves worked side by side in the muck, unified by the democratic hope of the placer mine, the belief that any man with a shovel and a pan could strike it rich. However, this equality was fleeting. Without the stabilizing presence of family and community infrastructure, churches, schools, and domestic life, the camps quickly devolved into centers of vice. Gambling was the primary social pastime and a crucial economic engine. It was both a desperate attempt to multiply meager earnings and a psychological release from the grueling labor. Faro, poker, and roulette tables operated 24 hours a day. The saloons and gambling halls, often elaborate structures in the larger camps, became the de facto social centers, providing light, warmth, and the constant, intoxicating possibility of instant fortune. The lack of women, however, contributed to profound psychological problems. Loneliness, alcoholism, and high rates of violence were endemic. The demand for female labor, primarily cooking, laundry, and domestic service, created an economic anomaly. Women who did arrive could command astronomical prices for their work. A simple meal could cost a day's wages, and laundry could cost as much as $8 per dozen items. Abigail Becker, a woman who opened a laundry service, reportedly made more money cleaning miners' clothes than most miners made digging for gold. This hyperinflated demand for domesticity underscored the instability of a society built entirely on the transient pursuit of mineral wealth. The Argonauts were defined by their single-minded focus, but they paid a heavy psychological price, existing in a rough, isolated world where the only permanent relationships were with their claim, their shovel, and their shared obsession with gold. The mining of gold in the early years was less a technical industry and more a desperate manual enterprise, evolving quickly as the accessible surface deposits were depleted. The entire endeavor was a race against time, as the easily found gold was finite, forcing constant innovation and increasing environmental destruction. Placer mining, the simple tools. The earliest and most iconic method was panning. A simple metal pan, often a tin cooking pan, was filled with gravel, submerged in the river, and shaken using a circular motion to allow the heavier gold flakes, or placer gold, to settle to the bottom. This method required little capital but immense physical labor. When the gold was abundant, a simple pan could yield a decent sum. As the gold became scarcer, miners moved to more efficient tools, the rocker or cradle, and the sluice box. The rocker was essentially a wooden box on rockers that used water to wash and separate the gravel. The sluice box was a long open wooden channel with riffles, small crossbars, installed at the bottom. Gravel and water were poured in, and the riffles caught the heavier gold while the lighter sand washed away. These methods required cooperation and more capital, fostering the first partnerships and basic organizational structures in the camps.
2. The shift to industrial mining. As the surface placer deposits vanished, the miners discovered the gold originated in hard rock formations, lodes, high in the mountains. This realization triggered the shift from individual effort to industrial or quartz mining. This required significant capital, heavy machinery, stamping mills to crush the rock, expensive tunneling, and permanent labor forces. The independent prospector was rapidly replaced by the corporate wage laborer. The gold rush transformed from a democratic, low-capital enterprise into a classic high-capital industrial operation, effectively ending the age of the individual 49er.